So welcome to the 2026 EEPRN Research Symposium, hosted by Smart Prosperity Institute. My name is Morena Winstanley. I'm SPI's Managing Director and will be your moderator for today. All right, so today you will hear from a range of different projects funded through the Economics and Environment Policy Research Network, lovingly called the EEPRN. Each session will be followed by a Q&A, so be sure to have your questions ready. We have also set aside some time at the end of the day for participants to share their reflections, so please keep any general comments, insights, anything you want to share until the end of the day. We really want to hear from you then. All right, let's get started. Those who have attended past EEPRN symposiums will already be familiar with the two gents who will open and close today's discussions. Dr. Jeffrey McCarney as SPI's Executive Director and Director of uOttawa's Institute of the Environment. Jeff is also an Associate Professor here at uOttawa, where he bravely teaches 8 a.m. stats classes on Monday mornings. Joining Jeff is Derek Hermanutz, Director General of the Economic Analysis Directorate at ECC. Welcome.
Logistical coordination up on the podium is one of the hardest things we can do today. So thank you. Yeah, I swear the university is a pure test of charisma is whether you can get anybody in their chair at 8 a.m. in January for a stats class. Thank you for coming today. As Marina mentioned, I'm SPI's Executive Director, and I'm also the Director of the Institute of the Environment here at the University of Ottawa, which hosts the Economics and Environmental Policy Research Network. Today's symposium is titled New Research for Uncertain Times. I don't have to tell you about the uncertain times we find ourselves in. Instead, I'll begin by highlighting some of the exciting new research we have in store for you today. You'll hear from some of Canada's top researchers, but also, and more importantly, current graduate students and rising stars for the future, on how we can waste less while improving social, environmental, and economic outcomes. How Canadian firms and organizations are responding to policy cues and improving their environmental performance, and how energy policy can better align with our social goals. In sum, we are here today because we believe in the power of good research to inform better outcomes for both economic and environmental policy in Canada, and in particular in the importance of two-way exchange between researchers and policymakers to enable that. This has been the goal of the EEPRN since its inception as a collaboration between the University of Ottawa and Environment and Climate Change Canada, along with others in our network, more than a decade ago. I'd like to thank ECC for their continuing trust in us and for their continuing support of this project. The kind of long-term, dependable funding they have provided has been the key feature allowing for a deep, wide, and engaged network to grow and build trust and collegial exchange among its members. And the results of the network demonstrate this. While the EEPRN was established in 2012, it really emerged into its current form in 2017 with an expansion in funding and renewal of its mandate. Since that time, we have, on average, supported more than 10 projects a year and directly supported almost 150 graduate student researchers in policy-oriented environment economy research during that time. And the results are all around us. As I increasingly encounter the students we have supported now as colleagues who work with the federal provincial government departments, with environmentally focused NGOs in Canada, in sustainably oriented roles in the private sector, or even as colleagues in academia whose own students we are now funding. There is now a network of environment economy policy expertise in Canada that has been built up through the EEPRN. This work by the EEPRN is particularly important during times of uncertainty. At SPI, we think a lot about how to navigate uncertainty, both in terms of policy volatility and data scarcity. The conclusions of our own work on this topic can be summarized in 3 points. 1, avoiding lock-in. The decisions made today define the options available to decision makers down the road. This is especially important for emerging technologies, where it's unclear which technology will be ascendant. Employing more agile approaches to regulation and policymaking can help avoid making decisions that are out of step with rapid technological evolution. Second is recognizing trade-offs. Transitions are disruptive. They create winners and losers. Understanding the trade-offs inherent in policymaking can bolster policy durability by allowing for negative impacts to be mitigated, but also by informing communication efforts. This is important when the trade-off is economic, but also when it is environmental, such as the critical mineral demand spikes that will accompany low-carbon energy technologies. Not taking trade-offs into account can undermine climate action by alienating those who value environmental protection more broadly. It also opens up mitigation to claims of hypocrisy. Lastly is getting the incentives right. My fellow economists will argue that this means price signals, and I agree, but we need to go beyond carrots and sticks towards lowering the risks associated with innovation and the adoption of sustainable practices and technologies. We are experiencing firsthand that no economic transition pathway is smooth, and we need to help those who invest in a more sustainable future live to see that future through the turmoil. However, that is from our work. I look forward today to seeing the research and policy implications of the work of our network members and students on the topic of new research for uncertain times. Thank you for coming today, and at this point, I'd like to invite Derek Hermanutz to also share some opening thoughts.
We're navigating the podium here. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to keep it short. Thanks, Jeff, for those introductory words. Thanks to Smart Prosperity Institute and University of Ottawa for this joint venture that we've been doing since 2012, I guess. I'm not sure if anyone here was at the original 2012 symposium. I was. I think I've been at every one since, and probably Jeff, you too, hey? And oh, you missed 2012, rookie. So anyway, really looking forward. It's been too long since we've had one of these, so I'm looking forward to seeing the results of the research that was funded through the network. And on behalf of Environment and Climate Change Canada, welcome you all, and thanks for attending.
All right, can we load the next slides? Thank you both. All right, now I'd like to introduce our first session of the day, Circular Economy Policy Insights from Across Canada. Please welcome Nubi Afolasade from the University of Ottawa. Nubi is a doctoral student at the Institute of the Environment, where her research focuses on the role of businesses in creating a circular economy. She will present findings from the project Building a Circular and Low Carbon Construction Industry. Following Nubi will be Kate Mullock. Kate is also a PhD student here at uOttawa and most recently worked as a labor market economist at the OECD. She will share insights from a circular economy policy inventory for Canada. Please welcome both to the stage and ready your questions for after.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Afolasade Nubi, and I'll be presenting today a project on building a circular and low-carbon construction industry through policy integration. This is a collaborative project led by my supervisor, Professor Diana Matsusis. So, all right, so this is our outline for today. Okay, so basically, what's our motivation? Our motivation is hinged on the fact that the C&D sector has always been in the media. As a result of the shortfall in affordable housing, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation estimates that we would need about 3.5 to 5.8 million new homes that must be built by 2030 for us to be able to reach affordability by 2030. This means that Canada has to build more rapidly. And this also, indirectly leads to the fact that more construction has to be done, and then more emissions might happen if we don't get to sustainable construction. All right, still, why the construction industry, you might want to ask? The construction industry lies at the nexus of environmental opportunities and challenges. Globally, this sector emits about 40% of CO2. In Canada, it's about 17%. This same sector also generates about 30% solid waste. In Canada, it's about 12%. And then the raw materials consumption is on the high. Yet, we have the opportunities, which is the fact that we have about 7% national employment from the construction and development sector. From research, we know that this sector is definitely very slow to sustainable innovation. And guess what? Canada has committed to 40% emission reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. To achieve this, we have to transition to a low economy and adapt secular principles. So, our research questions. We had 3 research questions. How do decision makers in the C&D organization make sense of low carbon and circular economy business model? 2, what is the role of low carbon and circular economy policies in driving sustainable changes in the construction industry? And 3, what policies or regulatory changes are needed to better integrate low carbon and circular objectives into the construction and development projects? So for this project, our method was really clear. We had to have 3 sequential stages. We had 3 stages for the project. First was, what do we know? This we did by having a systematic literature review, which we have completed. The next question was, what policy existed? And so we had to do a policy mapping and also document review, which we have also completed on the second stage. And then we're on the third stage right now, which is, how is industry really responding to this? And then we had to do interviews and then qualitative analysis, which is presently ongoing. All right, so for the first stage, our results were, basically, we had this systematic literature review. And then we used the Web of Science. The articles we had used, or the publications we used, was from 2016 to 2014. We were focused on Canada. And then we had our inclusion criteria, which was basically these articles, these publications had to be low carbon or circular economy focused, relevant to the C&D industry, and must be empirical research. We looked at them along the building life cycle, which is from land use all the way to end of life. So while we're doing the systematic literature review, we actually just found 19 relevant papers, which also, of course, showed that there was a gap. We then had to include 36 research reports to actually conduct this systematic literature review. So our findings for this first stage, it shows that there were limited empirical evidence linking policy to construction outcomes. There were a strong downstream policy focus. So the policies were actually focused on the downstream when we're talking about the life cycle of a building. Basically, the policies focused on construction, operations, and end of life. We realized that upstream remained insufficiently addressed. That means that land use, for example, design, and management were not addressed in policy. Operations were dominated in literature, so most of the research that we actually did the literature review dominated were just on the operational side. And then circular economy integration remained fragmented across the life cycle. So what does this imply? Policy design remains reactive rather than integrated along the building life cycle. So this finding, we actually presented this at ASAC in 2025 in Waterloo. This was one of our presentations there. So for the second stage, like I said, for the second stage, what we wanted to do was, we wanted to know what policy existed. And so we did policy mapping and extended document review. So this spanned from April 2025 to October 2025. So what we did was, from the first stage, we had identified we had 19 articles, but then we moved to having to look at the reports, which was industry reports and government reports. So we had 36 reports that we had from the first stage. We included 14 more that we found during this period. And then we looked at government's websites, legislative databases, public databases, and media. And then what we did was, from all of the policies that we are mapping, we coded them in terms of governance level. So we looked at the policies in terms of the federal, provincial, and municipalities. We looked at 5 main municipalities, which were Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, and Ottawa. And then we also coded them along the instrument type. We wanted to know if they were regulatory or economic, and then we also wanted to understand what kind of enforcement. So we looked at them through mandatory and voluntary enforcement mechanism. We also coded them along the policy focus to be ensured that were they low carbon policies or were they circular policies, or they also concentrate on both. And then we also coded them along the building life cycle, which is from land use all the way to the end of life. And so with this document, we also looked at the industry alignment based on the policies. So these were our findings. We found 184 low carbon and circular relevant policies in the C&D sector when we mapped it. And then this comprised of 28 federal policies, 116 provincial policies, and 40 municipal instruments. Looking at the graph here, so basically while we focused on the federal, we realized that majority of the policies were regulatory and voluntary from the federal level. Same thing for also the provincial level. There were more regulatory policies that were voluntary, except for Ontario, that had more mandatory policies. Like I said, we also coded them across the policy focus, which was low carbon and low carbon circular economy, or whether the policies were both. And then we realized that we had more policies in British Columbia, and then Quebec, and then Ontario. But across the province, we realized that most of the policies were low carbon, and the circular economy was just emerging. All right, so the key findings. So for this second stage, it actually reinforced what we found in the first stage from the systematic literature review, that the policy landscape is fragmented and uneven across the province. And then current policy landscape, it's primarily low carbon focused, and then circular economy is just emerging. Majority of the policies focused on the operational performance, which was energy efficiency. And then we realized that policy coordination across levels of government were limited. Like I said earlier, Ontario was very distinct because it had high mandatory and regulatory approach. For the Northern Territories, we realized that they also had voluntary mechanisms, but then they also had economic tools for their enforcement. So, like I said, we had 50 documents that we had reviewed from the first stage and the second stage. And so we did an industry gap, policy gap mapping, and then realized that there were lack of uniform standards. This were what the industry was saying. Lack of uniform standard definitions, and we didn't have reliable data system. Policies still remained focused on operations, and then we had inconsistency from provincial and municipal regulations. There was weak coordinations, and then, of course, economic barriers, high cost of reused materials, low land use fees, limited incentives for reuse and circular practices. And then we had supply chain and infrastructure barriers, cultural capacity. People want to build more cheaply and fast. Overall, the insight was that policy signal exists. Yes, there are policies, but gaps in standard, governance, market, and the capacity limits industry transition. All of this really limits industry transitions. Okay, so for stage 3, what we did was, like I said, is basically for us to be able to respond, industry response. How are the industry responding? And they wanted to talk to the experts. So we are having industry interviews. So basically, we had 26 interviews right now. We have done 26. We intend to have 35 interviews. This we have benchmarked with other reports from CSA. And then preliminarily, we started coding, and this is going to be an outcome. This is going to be an outcome that would end up being one of my PhD papers. So basically, we've done 26 interviews, and then our early insights are showing that it's still policies that are still operational dominance, and then we have varied industry responses to policy pressures. Economic and operational constraints are shaping decisions right now. Oh, like I said, okay, so for the second stage, just to mention, we also had we have the publication right now that is in review at the Business and Society, and also at ASAC. We also have that in review right now. We've submitted that for review. All right, and so in conclusion, Canada's construction sector is central to both climate and circular economy transitions. Policy landscapes are expanding, but remain fragmented and uneven across jurisdiction and, of course, across the life stages. Current policy mix is predominantly low carbon focused, with circular economy integrating still very limited. Industry faces structural barriers in standard, governance, market infrastructures, and capacity. Final thoughts. Accelerating sustainable construction in Canada require coordinated, life cycle integrated policy, design that aligns life's low carbon and circular economy objectives with industry realities. So our policies need to look at all of the building life cycle and also integrate both low carbon and circular economy objectives. So what are the expected outcomes for SPI? So first, we've completed 2 conference papers presentation at ASAC 2025 and 2026, 1 journal article on the view, and then to complete is our third stage. To be completed is our third stage, which is basically a thesis paper that will be coming out from that. And then, of course, we're going to be having an integrated final report of stage 1, 2, and 3. And then we intend to also have a compendium submission, a blog post, and we're also thinking of having some knowledge mobilization activities. Thank you very much to EEPRN, SPI, SHERC, and also to our research support student that also helped with this project. Thank you very much. I hope I was within the 15 minutes.
Thanks, Nubi, for the presentation. Hi, my name is Katharine Mullock, sorry. Thank you. And I actually have the distinction of being the only researcher who's not funded by EEPRN, actually. So shout out to the University of Calgary and their C2P2 program, which funded this work. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa in the Institute of the Environment, and I'm excited to share this work with you, which I think represents a useful first step in framing the policy landscape around the circular economy in Canada. I also want to give a shout out to Bailey Fleet, who's the master's student who did the groundwork in assembling the policies and coding the policies in this framework. So what do we mean when we talk about circular economy? I think Nubi's already kind of given us a good taste of this. I'll refer to a definition that Smart Prosperity put together a few years back in a briefing report. The circular economy is a solution framework for responding to global challenges of unsustainable resource use and their environmental impacts. So this is relating to emissions and climate change, but it's also more general and relating to environmental degradation. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation also identifies 3 core principles for putting this framework into action. And they relate to 1, designing waste and pollution out of the economy and out of production. 2, keeping products and materials in use longer. And 3, making sure that natural systems are regenerated. And this obviously has environmental benefits, but it also represents a huge economic opportunity. By one estimate, it could represent a $4.5 trillion opportunity through improved material efficiency, productivity, improvements, and innovation. But despite this opportunity, Canada is lagging behind on most accounts. So this chart here is showing the material use, or circular material use rate. So it captures the volume of recycled material in use as a share of total material in use. And you can see Canada has about 6% rate versus 12% in the EU, and well behind some leaders like the Netherlands with over 20%.
On top of that, Canada is also one of the top generators when it comes to production of waste, right up there with the United States and Australia. Now, a lot of the action on circularity happens in the private sector through innovation and entrepreneurship, but there's arguably a big role that policy can play in creating a supportive environment and addressing externalities. So we wanted to develop a policy inventory that would frame the current policy landscape at the municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal levels. This is a first of its kind inventory for Canada, and it is modeled on a similar policy inventory that was developed for climate policies by the University of Calgary's C2P2 program. And our research objectives in developing this inventory were: what is the current landscape of policies at each level of government, and where are the gaps in policy, and where are there some opportunities for policy harmonization? This is the process that we followed in assembling policies for this inventory. They were collected between November 2024 and early 2025. And we really leveraged the expertise of this government network that was being hosted by the Circular Economy Leadership Canada organization, CELC. And it was a network of about 12 governments, over 30 representatives across those governments that were advancing circular policy in their jurisdictions. And that engagement gave us an initial list of 66 policies. We then carried out some further engagement with academics and targeted government experts, and then also did a bit more of a Google search in areas or jurisdictions that were not as well represented in the government network. And altogether, that landed us with 122 policies in the network. And I'm showing here our inclusion and exclusion criteria for including a policy in the network or in the inventory. We included policies that government experts considered circular, so we're really relying on their expertise. And then we also included policies that we're using commonly accepted circularity terminology like repair, recycling, reuse, reduce, reuse. And we included policies that were either being implemented, were in progress, or announced, and didn't include those that had been sunset or no longer receiving funding. We also, if it was initiated by a non-government entity, we put it into a separate database called initiatives. So you only have policies that were initiated by government in this database. And it's also worth noting that we did not use as criteria for inclusion whether the policy would actually be successful in implementing circularity. So that's sort of like a later stage or a future project potentially to like evaluate the impact of these policies. And we coded policies according to a coding framework that was really mirrored on the inventory that developed for the climate policy inventory. And that was intentional with the idea of being able to compare and contrast climate policies to circular economy policies. Where are their complementarities? Where are there areas where they intersect and clash? We also developed some CE-specific categories, like the one I'm showing here, CE policy, which was borrowed from the UNIDO Chatham House Global Stocktake Report, where they were kind of doing an inventory of global CE roadmaps. And they cataloged all the different policy instruments across those roadmaps. So we wanted to be able to compare what does the breakdown of policies in Canada look like compared to other countries. Some caveats worth noting before jumping into findings. We tried our best, given the time we had, to capture the most relevant circular economy policies, but likely potential to make this even more comprehensive with more time. And also there's no weighting for either scope or effectiveness. So each policy in the inventory receives equal weight, regardless of whether it's municipal or federal. So to jump into some of the findings, this chart is documenting when CE policies were introduced. So among active policies, you can really see there was a tick up after 2016, which is roughly when circularity started to come onto the radar of policymakers globally. This chart is showing those policy categories that drawn from the UNIDO Global Stock Tape Report. And you can see Canada really has a focus on waste management and resource management. That's changed a bit since 2016, where there was really a broadening of policies and policy instruments. Before 2016, it was really narrowly focused on waste management, but we've seen a broadening since then. And this chart is showing policy breakdown by sector. And some sectors have a lot more policies than others. Construction and the built environment is really leading the pack with 48 policies in the inventory compared to an average of 15. And this is, so if you look at these exclamation marks, this is one think tank's estimation of which sectors are the most waste producing and the most resource using. So, I mean, we'd probably need to do this analysis specifically for Canada, but it's encouraging to see that a lot of the most high impact sectors are receiving policy focus in Canada. And this is just showing, like, it's the same thing I just showed you, but broken down by level of government. And you can see that in the municipal breakdown, that's really what's driving the focus on construction in the built environment. At the provincial and federal levels, the focus is more on how institutions are managing their waste, and also like national level legislation around electronics and plastics. This is showing policy count by jurisdiction, and I'll focus on the chart on the right, the bar graph, which is showing breakdown by province. And as a federal country, we have the advantage of each province kind of gets to experiment with different types of policies, which is an advantage. The disadvantage is it can be difficult to reach policy harmonization, and that's been identified as one of the key barriers to Canada becoming more circular, is that a lot of these initiatives require a certain amount of economies of scale, and without harmonization across jurisdictions, that can be difficult. So you've got the leaders in circularity are Quebec, BC, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, and there's a lot of room for policy development in other jurisdictions. A natural question is, how does Canada compare internationally? And that's particularly relevant given Canada's low material circularity rate. Compared to countries in a global study carried out by UNIDO and Chatham House, Canada has a higher concentration of CE policies in waste management and resource management. And by contrast, we have a lower concentration in areas like brokering, which is like data exchange, fiscal instruments, research and innovation, business support, and product and producer requirements. So there's a potential there going forward to shift policy focus to how to build ecosystems that are conducive for circularity. And here we can draw some inspiration from countries that are further along in their circular transition. One of the areas that Canada is lagging behind a little bit is in brokering and product requirements. And Europe's digital product passports provides a good example in this area. These are now required for products like textiles, electronics, and batteries sold within the EU since last year. And it's sort of like, it requires that they indicate the material content of the passport in a barcode in the product, which is really supportive when you, like for the future life of the product, whether it's gonna be recycled or repaired. Other countries in Scandinavia are making use of fiscal instruments. In Sweden, labor costs on home repair and maintenance are eligible for a 50% tax deduction. Denmark puts taxes on all extracted raw materials in order to incentivize the use of recycled materials. Another way to think about the policy development process is as a clean innovation model. So this is a model that SPI developed for clean tech a few years back. And you can think about the early stages of an innovation, research and development. You need to have push policies to get to drive new ideas, new technologies, and then later in the process, it's more about diffusion and deployment, and that's when you need pull policies to build out markets. And all along the way, you need strengthened policies to make products marketable, or grow policies to make products marketable, and strengthen policies to strengthen the overall system. So we've coded the 122 circular economy policies according to this framework. And you can see that there's relatively more in the pull category and in the strengthen category, and less in the grow and push, which maybe makes sense if you think about how clean tech compares to circular economy, where circular economy is not necessarily about driving a particular technology as much as it is about finding new ways of producing and consuming. Here are some examples of the types of policies that go into each of these categories. And so Canada is really putting an emphasis more on the pull side, so extended producer responsibility, deconstruction bylaws, et cetera. I'll end here by just planting a seed for how this inventory could be used in the future. I mentioned one of the potential areas for research that could be productive could be taking this policy inventory alongside the climate policy inventory to compare and contrast, like where are there complementarities between the two types of policies and where do they clash in terms of objectives. Also thinking about what would it take to sequence circular economy policies optimally, and what does like an optimal circular transition look like in terms of policies. Lots of ways to extend the inventory going forward, focusing a little bit more on territorial coverage and northern municipal jurisdictions would be useful for comprehensiveness and also for capturing more Indigenous-led circularity policies. And as I mentioned earlier, it would be great to have policy effectiveness indicators or policy stringency indicators, and that would likely require like a sector-by-sector approach, which would be take some time, but be very much worthwhile. So thank you for your attention. I encourage you to go to this link on the CELC website. It houses both the policy inventory and the initiatives inventory, and hope you'll make use of it for your personal interest or future research. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. What a way to get started. Let's open up the question and answer period. Some wonderful SPI staff will come around with a microphone. I know everybody here has many years of musical theater experience and doesn't want to use a microphone, but please do for the sake of the recording later. So who would like to go first? First question. Jeff.
I'll come to a question, but just a quick point I think is interesting, because Kate mentioned at the beginning that she's one of the only non-EPRN researchers here, and that's only kind of true, because the C2P2 network that she's working with, led by Jen Winter at the University of Calgary, if you go back to when it started, before it got its current funding, which is well funded by SSHRC and Environment Climate Change Canada, started with Jen submitting a proposal to the EPRN for this project. And our steering committee reviewed it and go, actually, this is actually really important and much bigger than we could ever fund, but we'd be happy to work with you in helping to build this up. And we've been a proud partner of that network since then, engaging students like Kate in it, sharing its research with our network, and trying to encourage our researchers to use the policy inventories that are coming out to support their research. So there's a connection that way. which I thought was helpful to point out here. My question, which I'll come to, is sort of for both Nubi and Kate. Nubi, I was interested in your framework, and when you showed your map, it looked like you were classifying things as low carbon policies or circular economy policies, but there were some that you were classifying as both, if I understood you right. And I was curious if you could talk me through what kind of policies were captured in that both segment, sort of what you were seeing or what led them to be classified as both, or is it sort of a different kind of policy framework or just particularly what they're targeting, just sort of what those look like? And Kate, I'm curious, similarly in your review, did you come across a lot of policies that could have fallen in either bucket, right? Your CE inventory or the low carbon inventory, and what did they look like and how did you deal with that?
All right, thank you very much for your question. So we had some policies that were really very focused on circularity. Like Kate said, repair, recycle, that had those ones. And then we also had policies that were very low carbon focused, energy efficiency, operational level of the building. But then we also had some policies that focused on both. So those were the ones that we actually classified as low carbon and circularity. So if any policy had a bit of both, we classified them as that category that fell into low carbon and circular economy policies. But if the policies were basically just on circularity, on principles of circularity, we classify that as just circular economy. So basically that was what we did. Thank you. Or does Diana have something else to say? Thank you.
Yeah, and to echo that, I think there was quite a bit of overlap that we identified in the inventory without having yet gone through and coded which policies are would count as low carbon. Just eyeballing it looked like a good chunk, like even as much as half, seemed to have some low carbon focus, and particularly in the construction sector, there was a number of like embodied carbon policies that were included. The ones that seem to be in the construction sector that seem to be circular specific were really around demolition. Like, I think there was a number of municipalities that had this bylaw in place that like 75% of the materials in a demolition project had to either be recycled or reused for another project, which is clearly got a circular focus, but yeah, we saw both.
Other questions? Yes, Sarah.
Hi, thank you for your, Thanks for your presentations. Kate, I'm so glad you ended yours with one of the future research recommendations was effectiveness, because I think we all know here, one of the criticisms sometimes of academia is, okay, so what? There's so many policies out there. Are they actually landing? And so a question for both of you, in your research, are there any existing studies on effectiveness at all, or is this just totally untouched territory when it comes to each of your subject matters there?
Want me to take this one? Yeah, so the very first paper that we wrote there, this is systematic literature review, we were looking for exactly that. We wanted to identify exactly are there any studies that have looked at the impact of the policies on actual practice? We didn't find any. We found 19 studies total, and of those, a lot of them were just, we were looking for empirical evidence, and a lot of the empirical evidence was just another systematic literature review. So there were very, very few studies that have looked at the actual effectiveness in Canada of the policies on practice. So huge opportunity for research there. Yeah.
Especially now with increasing fiscal constraints across the board, it seems it'll be even more important. So that's great.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think it's also because it's like quite like to actually analyze effectiveness of circularity. You're not just looking at one measure, like for climate policies, where it's like, does this reduce emissions or not? Like, you're looking at, does it reduce the use of raw materials? Does it reduce the production of waste? And I think it's very different. Like the indicators you're looking at are very different for each sector. It almost requires like a full life cycle analysis to really assess whether the policy was effective or not.
So which is why we're doing the interviews. So we've interviewed so far about 26 experts in the industry along the life cycle, and I don't know what my preliminary finding, if you will, just from anecdotally, we haven't done the actual analysis, but it's the policies aren't making a whole hell of a lot of difference. So it's just it's something that is that needs a lot more research. Yeah.
Next question, Nicholas.
Yes, hello, Nicolas Drouin with Environment and Climate Change Canada with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and my focus is on biodiversity. So I realize for both of you, the research is focused on circular economy and low carbon policies. And I was wondering, as you conducted your research, did you find any evidence of, for example, risks associated with biodiversity loss and the ecosystem services they provide? For example, flood mitigation, in terms of how these policies are being considered in the construction sector, for example, where you said the tendency is to build quick and at a lower cost, which may have a detrimental impact on the insurability downstream and the cost of natural disasters, for example. So were you able to identify some considerations related to these as you looked at your research, your policy research? So I'd be interested to see that, as you may be aware as well, in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there's also references to, there's a target 16 on sustainable consumption and waste reduction. So there's several issues that are related to the topics that you're doing. So I was just curious if you stumbled upon some information on that.
Well, not exactly. Well, the only thing I would say was that what we realized is from the building life cycle, from the early stage, which is land development, we actually didn't find a lot of policies that were addressing that level. Even at the project design, end of life, we didn't have so much policies, so we really didn't have anything that was actually speaking to conservation, per se.
And I think it's an important issue, and I think we could use that lens to kind of look at the policy inventory and to sort of go through and evaluate and assess like which of these policies are thinking about biodiversity and conservation. We haven't taken that lens yet, but I think it's definitely a way that the policy inventory could be used.
And not to jump in on the SPI side, but to also jump in on the SPI side. We're doing some critical strategic mineral work that is starting to layer in that consideration, particularly, of course, at the site of the mining site. And it really just broadening out the objectives that we assess policies on, I think, is a really important point, and something that I think we're all trying to grapple with and integrate as we go forward. Break time. Please meet us back here at 11:15. Coffee is right outside, and like I said, there's the lounge just on the other side there if you'd like a little change of scene. I'll see you soon. Hello again. I hope you are all well caffeinated and ready for our headline session, Environmental Policy in Uncertain Times. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Stephanie Cairns, who is Senior Director, Strategy and Foresight at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions at the University of Victoria, which means that Stephanie has been kind enough to swap +5 degrees for -15. Thanks, Stephanie. I first had the joy of meeting Stephanie over a decade ago when I joined SPI as the coordinator of the EEPRN. Stephanie's list of accomplishments is eclipsed only by her humility, so I won't embarrass her by reading her full bio. However, I will mention that she was a founding staff member with both Pembina Institute and SPI, and is currently a coordinating lead author for the North American Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Jeff and Derek, for this opportunity. It's so great to be back at an EEPRN, that's a really hard word to say, symposium. And I was asked to reflect today on 3 things. First, what has changed in federal environment and economic policy? Second, where new policy priorities and opportunities are emerging? And third, how academic research can best inform smart public policy in this moment. So I'm going to give a fairly high-level talk. I'm going to situate current policy shifts within this broader hinge moment, and then I'm going to dive more deeply into the two dimensions of climate policy, mitigation and adaptation. And I'm going to close each of those sections with the implications for academic research. Now, I come to this presentation from several vantage points. I've spent more than 30 years working on energy, environment, and climate policy, so I've been around a few chapters of this issue, working first on Parliament Hill and then with several national think tanks, as Marina mentioned, with Smart Prosperity, and now with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which brings together the research strengths of 4 BC universities. Finally, I'm a British Columbian, and in BC, climate change has become a really lived and repeated experience. Over the last 5 years, we've gone through a record-breaking heat wave. The town of Lytton burnt to the ground. Over 600 people died due to the heat, mostly in the lower mainland area. Billions of intertidal marine organisms were baked by the heat. 5 months later, an atmospheric river dropped almost 11 inches of rain, leading to the failure of flood defenses. All the major highways and railways to the lower mainland were cut off for days and days, and more than 1,000 farms were affected. And in 4 of the last 6 years, we've had record-breaking extreme wildfire seasons. In fact, summer is now being called smoke season in BC. This is having tremendous impact on communities. So those events happening so close together and at escalating levels of intensity, it feels, have really etched climate vulnerabilities into the minds of many British Columbians, as many other Canadians across the country. Let me start by reviewing the larger context within which environment and economy policy is now evolving. For me, like for many of you, I'm sure, this past year has felt like a tipping point between real promise on the one hand and real successes on some of our environmental goals, but very real peril for those goals. Let me start with the promise. The global clean energy transition is no longer hypothetical. In most regions of the world, renewables are now the cheapest source of new electricity generation. Solar and wind capacity is being added at a record pace. Estimates of solar installs are reaching about 2 gigawatts per day. That's equivalent to 1 to 2 large nuclear or coal-fired plants. And global investments in clean energy are now 2 times more than in fossil fuels. Many jurisdictions are leapfrogging or abandoning fossil fuel-based systems entirely. And in doing so, energy importing countries and energy importing communities, such as one we'll hear about later today, are finding greater energy security, more affordable power, and expanded access. In the meantime, battery costs have also fallen dramatically. A systemic shift, which is enabling grid flexibility, accelerating electric vehicle adoption, changing reliability planning, and altering industrial investment decisions. In BC, at least, this clean energy transition is now also intersecting with economic reconciliation with First Nations. BC Hydro's recent calls for utility-scale independent power projects have led to a significant surge in the equity participation by First Nations in the province's power sector. So now we have climate policy potentially intersecting with economic justice and long-term wealth generation. That's all real momentum. But, and it's a very significant but, this promise is unfolding against an avalanche of peril. Geopolitical instability, national security tensions, domestic political fragmentation, a deep affordability crisis in Canadian households, the accelerating new normals of wildfire, flood, storm, and extreme heat, and the 6th mass biodiversity extinction. On the surface, these pressures appear to have pushed climate action down on the policy agenda. But if we look more closely, climate is not peripheral in this polycrisis. It is embedded within so many of those issues. Competition for influence in an opening Arctic. The global race for the critical minerals for a digitalized and electrified future. tensions between petrostate and electrostate visions of the future, and who is going to win that race. The rising costs of beef, dairy, cocoa, coffee, fresh produce, all of this is driven by climate volatility and affecting household budgets. Escalating insurance premiums are as well, and those are escalating because of climate disasters. So climate isn't separate from these issues. It's now interwoven with security, with trade, with affordability, with fiscal stability, and with the resilience of entire ecosystems. Which brings us to environment economy policy itself, now in a moment of transition and turbulence. Mitigation policy is being reoriented from an emissions-first framing to a competitiveness-first framing. And second, even as climate impacts compound across human and natural systems, adaptation capacity is simply not keeping pace with the needs that there are. And yet, across both these themes, something fundamental is happening. Climate policy is being recast from the side stage of environmental management to the main stage of economic strategy. Let me illustrate it by moving on to the second of my main topics, where new policy priorities are emerging, and starting with the reorientation of mitigation policy. Now, I've been around climate policy for some decades, in fact, and the big kind of change with the 2015 Pan-Canadian framework was its heavy reliance on flexible, economically oriented instruments: carbon pricing, compliance flexibility, tax credits, subsidies, and those built on top of voluntary programs and transparency tools that had been in previous climate policy. However, as the policy stringency of these tools increased, the model encountered some very real constraints. Despite measurable reductions, progress on aggregate emissions has remained incremental and insufficient to meet Canada's targets. Consumer-facing policies have become subject to sustained and deliberate misinformation campaigns and politically polarized. The fiscal capacity of governments has limited the scalability of many of the household subsidies, particularly in British Columbia, where the repeal of the consumer carbon tax removed roughly $2 billion in annual revenue from fiscal coffers. And frictions with oil and gas producing provinces has generated constitutional conflict. In practice, climate policy was remaining adjacent to the central domains of industrial strategy, of macroeconomic management, and of public investment. It was operating alongside economic policy rather than shaping it. Over the past year, key elements of that architecture have been dismantled, reshaped, scaled back, or suspended. The industrial carbon pricing system, which is arguably the most consequential of the mitigation instruments, does remain, but its effectiveness will depend on a set of yet-to-be-announced decisions on future price collars, on alignment with provincial systems, and indeed its political durability across governments. Beginning with 2022 with the emissions reduction plan and evolving now with the recent climate competitiveness strategy, Canada is now attempting to integrate mitigation into industrial policy itself, and this is the biggest shift that we're seeing. This approach is reframing climate action as central to economic competitiveness and national security, industrial transformation, and trade diversification. And the federal auto strategy is the clearest example we have yet of this pivot. Now, many interpret recent developments as a retrenchment of climate policy. And I will say the jury is still out, and I could give you a whole talk on how we can be cynical about that issue. But I think it's important for us also to think about, is this a signal of the maturing of climate policy? Does it represent a structural renovation of climate policy, one that may ultimately enable deeper and more durable emission reductions? So I think few would argue that addressing the structural drivers of emissions, not just focusing on emissions through price signals, addressing those structural drivers is undoubtedly essential for deep decarbonization. But embedding climate policy within industrial strategy is going to increase the complexity, the fiscal exposure, and the political stakes of climate policy. And we're already seeing now that negotiations on climate policies are involving the Prime Minister and premiers. And with this, there are broader political issues on the table that lead to different types of deals and trade-offs than when it was treated as principally an environmental issue. As a result, there are also risks to meeting emission targets. So, how can academic research best inform smart mitigation policy in this moment of change? Well, for researchers, the shift is towards a climate competitiveness framework changes the analytical terrain. The focus moves from optimizing economy-wide instruments to understanding the interactions between industrial strategy, the types of mechanisms that can be used to encourage mitigation within that industrial strategy, and how industrial strategy is going to link with mitigation outcomes. The real question is, can this new model deliver deeper, faster, and more durable decarbonization? Or does competitiveness framing ultimately constrain climate ambition? How about adaptation policy? I think of adaptation policy as mitigation's younger cousin. Essentially, is far less developed in policy design, in institutional capacity, and in implementation mechanisms. Mitigation has had decades of studies and policy experimentation behind it. Adaptation is different. Yes, Canada has laid important foundations, a pan-Canadian adaptation framework, a multi-year national science assessment, and growing analytical capacity, including world-leading research on climate impacts. The economic stakes are enormous. The average annual weather-related disaster losses over the past decade are equivalent to roughly 5 to 6% of Canada's annual GDP growth. That's the past decade. We're still early in the curve of escalating impacts. Yet on the ground, our ability to prepare for and manage these impacts is not keeping pace with the impacts themselves. Consider this experience in British Columbia. British Columbia is considered a national leader in adaptation planning. The province established a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. They expanded community preparedness funding. They strengthened wildfire mitigation programs, developed a flood strategy, and have supported Indigenous resilience efforts. All meaningful steps. But I just lost my talk. There it is. Just a minute. All meaningful steps, but the uncomfortable truth is that there's been a huge gap in going from the planning to the actual operationalizing of adaptation information. The government is remaining structurally reactive and is choking on the scale of funding required for proactive adaptation preparedness. And yet, the risk of post-disaster recovery costs will run many times greater. So a few examples: plans to require local governments to undertake comprehensive climate and disaster risk assessments have been delayed due to capacity and resource constraints. Land use planning is still not fully aligned with wildfire and floodplain risk, even as development pressures place more homes and businesses in harm's way. Small and remote communities who are facing the highest climate risks from things like wildfires, and many of these are First Nations, are lacking the financial and technical capacity to prepare and respond. Infrastructure vulnerabilities from the 2021 flood events, including major trade and transportation corridors, remain only partially addressed. So this is very much an economic issue, and an issue where kind of the economic analysis of the climate community and the experience of the climate community in kind of bringing theory into policy is sorely needed. Adaptation has not yet fully permeated sectoral economic strategy, despite many sectors already suffering from climate volatility. Just one example. In 2023, wildfire smoke was the cause for 3/4 of the weather-related cancellations of outdoor cultural events, such as musical festivals. So we think of kind of some of the big sectors, but tourism is being very heavily affected as well. too often, planning is anchored in yesterday's climate. This is also the conclusion of the forthcoming North American Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment, where we found that while Canada is party to numerous international climate and biodiversity commitments, outdated laws and policies are a key factor impeding the ability for meeting these ambitions. Essentially, most of our environmental environmental laws need to be renovated, essentially, to have a forward-looking perspective on climate as opposed to assuming the climate of the past. In fact, only 2 federal statutes specifically refer now to the linkage between biodiversity and climate change. In short, similar to mitigation policy, adaptation policy needs to move from the side stage of environmental policy to the main stage of fiscal policy, of infrastructure strategy and land use policy, of reconciliation and of economic resilience. So again, how can academic research best inform smart public policy? My colleagues at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions were asked by the BC government to frame a research agenda aimed at closing the gap between climate science and practical risk assessment. And I invite you to read the full report on our website. It's called Bridging Climate Research and Risk Assessments. And through this worked over more than a year with a multidisciplinary academic advisory group, interviews, focus groups, literature review to identify central research priorities. And what they really found is that climate science, there's a big gap between how you translate climate science into the real world risk assessment tools that are what local governments, private sector, provincial governments, et cetera, actually are using in real time when they make decisions. And they have a long set of recommendations about the specific gaps that need to be met there and the potential role for researchers in helping to fill gaps, such as closing data gaps on key risks like wildfire, drought, heat, and flood, bringing interdisciplinary and co-designed approaches and other types of knowledges, including Indigenous knowledges, into that work in order to accelerate resilience, and how to use knowledge mobilization to make that research more actionable. So to close here, climate policy is experiencing its own hinge moment. The political economy of climate is shifting. Climate is being recast and is needing to be recast to step into the spotlight. From the side stage of environmental policy to the main stage of economic competitiveness, fiscal sustainability, and national security. Mitigation is being reframed. Adaptation is struggling to scale and to get implemented. For researchers, this is a moment to broaden the lens of climate research and to interrogate the durability, the distribution, the governance side, the fiscal exposure, and the institutional capacity of these new framings. Can we, as researchers, inform how to modernize these policy frameworks to match the opportunity presented and to meet the accelerating risks and perils? That's our duty. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Please welcome back to the stage Derek Hermanutz for a discussion on emerging policy priorities. And there'll be a question and answer session afterwards.
You all good?
Yeah.
Great.
Let's go. We got chairs for that.
Derek, you've been part of Canada's environmental policy for a long time. You've seen a few chapters come and go like I have. Can you give us your reflections on how environmental policy decisions, particularly around instrument choice and target setting, have changed over time? And also maybe where do you see it heading?
Sure, and I have some notes here. And that was a fabulous talk that you just gave. Covered most of what I had in my notes already, so I'll try and add some value. But I think I would say first on instrument choice, like as an economist in a previous life, I would have just said, okay, we have a negative externality here. solve for the price properly, and you're done. My thinking has evolved a little bit since then. Obviously, pricing is an important component, but I really think you need complementary measures as well. Pricing can work well at the margin, but we're not talking about marginal changes here when we're talking about climate change. We're talking about structural changes. And so we need things like regulations, like clean fuel regulations, clean electricity regulations. The coal regulations are like one of the biggest success stories in Canada, I think. Started in Ontario, and even Stephen Harper like brought in the original coal regs, right? And now we've seen through regs, but also through market forces, if you don't live in Saskatchewan, nobody's building like coal plants anymore, right? It's just not operational. So I think we've seen like an evolution from like a period of before 2015 where we wouldn't even talk about carbon pricing at the federal level to like the golden years maybe, 2015 pan-Canadian framework where we had a whole bunch of different instruments. And now kind of like you said, for various reasons, it's a bit of a hinge moment. So two things, circumstances have changed, so we have to like rethink the stringency and design of our regulations and policies. But also this government has a bit of a move away from like prohibitions and thou shall not do type things. So we've seen that in the government's not going forward with the oil and gas emissions cap, and also the repeal of the electric vehicle availability standard, EVAS. Stop there to see what you want to think, but then I think that question was also about targets too. So I don't know if you want to add anything to what I just said, or I can try and keep it short on targets. Yeah?
Actually, I want you to expand on one little thing, if
For
you
sure.
don't mind. So it was the Pan-Canadian Agreement on clean growth as
Clean
well.
growth and climate change,
And climate
exactly.
change. And we think a lot about the climate change part, but I'm interested in the clean growth part because my interpretation is that at that time it was very much on seeing, the export opportunity of Canadian technologies.
Right.
And we're seeing a shift now for that clean growth to actually be about our own economic development.
Right.
How do you are you seeing that? I guess that would be one question. And also, how would that kind of express itself differently in terms of policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the clean tech side, I'm not as up to date on the stats. I know, and this gets into sort of where we're moving into industrial policy, where there's, a big push to have things made in Canada for a number of different policy reasons, not just for like jobs, because arguably we can import clean tech from other countries if it's things that are economically efficient at good cost, good quality. And, from an economic perspective, you would argue that we should just import and go with that. So, but it's complicated. Yeah.
And what's happening with targets, including sector targets now? So, if you think under a cap and trade system, the theory at least is
Right.
that you have a pretty straightforward line to meeting your targets. As you kind of shift different and start to use a much broader mix of instruments, what does it mean for ability to land targets?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, Canada doesn't have a good record in hitting targets going back to Kyoto, and we're not likely to be hitting 2030, we know for sure, and 2035, I think, is in jeopardy. But it raises kind of a question with me, and I don't know what you think, there's level of ambition, so we've obviously set very ambitious targets, but you could argue, without ambition, you're not going to get to where we need to go. But I also wonder, about the time frame for targets. Setting a 2030 target in 2015 has its advantages, but do you think there's advantages to having more would have been an advantage to have a path or almost like a carbon budget set to get through those 10 or 15 years?
Well, I guess what interim targets give you is discipline in the journey. because otherwise you have things like we do see in jurisdictions where there's bold 2050 targets are announced and absolutely no pathway to get there. So the discipline of the targets, I think, is hugely important, and you know, the kind of really regular reporting and you know, assessment of whether you're on path. I see them personally, I see them as more of a kind of a signal of the type of ambition that you need than, you know, a pass or fail test in an exam. But they're really important in terms of showing the importance of early action as opposed to just delaying all your action to the end of your target period.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it can lead to, like in my experience, for a period of time, there was such a focus on like 1 year. Like we'd be asked to do the modeling for a bunch of different policies, and how much is that going to get us in 2030? And I always thought we were missing the, like, how much is that going to get us before 2030? How much is that going to, are we setting up for the transition to net zero in 2050? So I think there's a risk you can become sort of overly focused on a specific year target and not see sort of the bigger picture.
And lots of the, you know, lots of the initiatives actually have a delayed effect between policy and actual impact. Like we've, you know, we're really seeing that in the building sector in British Columbia, for instance, where there's really rigorous policies in place, but it's going to take a bit of time to actually start to influence the building stock.
Exactly.
And
if
to
you're
actually
just
show that
kind of laser focused
progress.
on 2030, you
Yeah.
might not prioritize those
Yeah.
types of initiatives.
So another question for you. There's been some, well, first of all, it's been a truly humbling year for some of us, carbon pricing geeks, to kind of see what happens when your favorite instrument enters the bullseye of politics and of misinformation and, you know, highly polarized situations. And there's been some interesting research done on how to better design and communicate climate policy in order to broadly maintain public support. Two of the things that we've been hearing about is one, that actually individuals don't like prohibitionary types of things, such as the way the EV adoption regs were kind of presented.
Right.
They want to still feel like they have agency, and so that whole issue of kind of how does the actual design of the instrument land with the public? Does it give people agency still? Another interesting piece that we're hearing is that some people in the policy sector are saying we should have less visible instruments, that we should actually be, that one of the failures of the carbon tax was that was so visible. Economists, of course, thought that was, you know, of value. But some people are saying we should use more invisible instruments to achieve our goals. What do you think about kind of this whole issue around communications and the choice of policy instrument?
Yeah, we could talk a lot about that. I think that, yeah, there's a couple of good examples, and you mentioned like the misinformation, and I think I'm not a communications expert, but you know, from an economics perspective, the fuel charge was kind of perfect in a way. Like from an efficiency standpoint, you know, you're pricing at the margin. That's what an economist wants to do, capture the externalities, as I said. But also on an equity basis, we had like a return system that meant that 80% of people were getting more, or were better off. They were receiving less, or they're receiving more than they were paying in the tax. So how could we not sell that? That's interesting. We do get into kind of misinformation and, you know, axe the tax, scrap the cap. I guess if you can make up slogans that rhyme, that seems to be effective. But there was a lot of disinformation in terms of how the fuel charge affected like prices of things, inflation in general, but also like food prices, et cetera, that, you know, were counter to the evidence. I don't know how you kind of solve that in the political climate, but I'm not a fan of trying to make things invisible. I think like from an economics perspective, but also just from like a plain perspective of being transparent and telling the truth to people. So the idea of the hidden tax was kind of how the people who are against the tax in the first place were trying to argue that it's hidden everywhere, and now that's like the clean fuel regs are our second invisible tax. So I think that's a tricky road to go down.
Marina, do we have time for one more? Yeah. What is your, we're seeing a real shift in regulatory and policy instruments. The objectives of climate policy have really multiplied. Like, I've been really struck at how everything is now climate, and working with university researchers. I mean, everybody sees climate as being part of their agenda, and there's so many objectives that need to be addressed as you're designing policy, so many trade-offs that need to be considered. Given all of this, what advice do you have for the researchers in the room in terms of emerging policy priorities? Also, how best to frame and communicate their findings?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I always say, like, with this network, there's definitely gains from trade for researchers to be interacting with policy makers, people within government who have a different view and are able often in some cases to provide data. But I think, and it comes back to kind of your point, need to be able to place climate in the broader context, at least in this period, like you said, in the hinge moment. Like, we have climate is still important, but we have industrial policy, we have national security, affordability issues, and I think the auto strategy is a good example of that. So I think when you're doing climate research, get away from just the textbook, like I used to think on pricing, and like observe real world, talk to people who are designing and implementing those policies, and there's a lot to learn. But we have a lot to learn from the academic community as well, so if that helps.
Sure.
So I think that was your cue, academic community. Questions for Derek and Stephanie? Yes.
I'm not the academic community. Okay. I'm a colleague of Derek's. I'm the Director General responsible for the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, the Government of Canada's, and it's great to hear my colleague in this great environment. And it was wonderful to hear, Stephanie, thank you for that brilliant expose on the context that we're in. I have to say that the strategy that we published for consultation in January, and I am advertising that actually quite blatantly here, because we welcome thoughts from the academic community on what that strategy should look like. But we were confronted with that very situation, also in a very trying to draft a strategy for the Government of Canada in real time as things like the EVAS, the electric vehicle standard, are being questioned, and the climate competitiveness strategy was being rewritten in this context of turbulence and fiscal capacity and all of these things coming together. So it was a challenge that I think you captured very well. My question, since the federal strategy in my role is really to bring together the Government of Canada's key sustainability targets, which is sometimes difficult to mobilize public organizations and who have to think about level of ambition and what we are credible at and what we can actually measure, is on, again, the importance of those targets. And I think I was thinking about the circular economy presentations earlier, and actually the panel that you were on at Globe 4 years ago, where we talked about the findings of the Council of Academies. And I wonder on the role of targets generally, how we can frame them and use them to mobilize. I guess I'll use Derek's idea, which to build a slogan. So it will be, can we market the target? Is that good? Can we market the target to mobilize people, or are we confusing matters by, we've talked about the climate target is in the draft strategy. It was short term. We focused on the short term target in the last strategy, but now we're looking more towards 2050 is what we're emphasizing in the strategy. So can we market the target to mobilize people to set that North Star, or are we distracting from the concrete things that people need to do on the ground?
Love the question. I think the question is which target needs to be communicated, and does, do you have, policy targets versus public targets? So, as some of you know, BC has just gone through a big independent review of its climate policy, Clean BC, and one of the central discussions in that review, among a lot of the people who are doing submissions, is our emissions-focused targets serving our communications purpose as well, because we end up talking about we've missed the target. I don't know what a ton of carbon looks like. I mean, I've been working on this for 30 years. So what is a ton of carbon? It's a completely, abstract notion. What the public cares about are things that relate to affordability, that relate to their daily choices, that relate to jobs. Can we kind of keep those targets in the back room, so to speak? They're still an important part of accountability, but can we actually start to talk about stuff in a much more tangible way? The number of, new renewable energy installations that are happening, heat pump adoption rates by households, the proportion of EVs that are happening, things that people can actually see and relate to and understand how they impact other dimensions of their lives. And I think this is part of that issue that we just talked about climate having to move from a science-centered, kind of emissions-focused early stage of its work into something where now it's needing to address many, many more types of dimensions in order to get the type of impact stringency, whatever you want to call it, that's needed. You need to actually be communicating it in ways that people can relate to. The emissions targets can all be there in the background, but what we talk about to the public has to be something that means something more to them. And that's related to high priorities that they already have.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly. But yeah, two quick things again, like the distance you are from your target, and I think building on your just comment, like, do people understand it? Do we all know what 40% below 2005 is in 2030? Like, who's got that in their head? And we just have to be careful too, as part of the international negotiations. We all want to keep up with all the other countries, but we need to always, know that Canada has, unique national circumstances, and we can't just mirror the targets for the EU and other countries, including the US, when they have one.
Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion, and thank you, Stephanie, for your talk. And it got me thinking, as you're talking about the shift in climate policy from, periphery, or however you want to frame it, into economic strategy and mainstream. Thinking back to the history of this network, and Derek working with you folks in 2012 or in 2014 when I joined, really just focus on economic instruments and thinking about carbon pricing and biodiversity, what they need to look like in the range of things we work on now. And what Stephanie was highlighting in terms of thinking about industrial policy, we're thinking about critical minerals policy, we're thinking about how all of that links to these climate dynamics. And I'm wondering your reflection on where Environment and Climate Change Canada is and how it works with other government departments has changed over that period, and what it looks like now versus what it used to look like in terms of how folks think about the research and maybe engaging with you folks, because my assumption would be it's changed substantially, but I'm curious how you see it.
Yeah, that's not sure how to exactly answer that. I think they're like the mix of influence of different departments within the federal government definitely changes. I think once the Pan-Canadian framework came in, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of demands on the department to coordinate the strategy. It was a very ambitious strategy, as you know, in terms of not just the number of programs, but the engagement with provinces and territories, multiple levels of Indigenous engagement. So I think it was a little tough for the department. There were some growing pains at first. Department not necessarily like a science-based department that all of a sudden was kind of more pushed into a policy role and even delivering programs. So that, I think, was a major challenge. Also, from some of my experiences and others, not being a central agency was a major challenge, trying to coordinate a climate plan and sending out emails to all the different departments. They're going to rank that Like, they're going to put that near the bottom of their priorities to respond when they have PCO and Department of Finance giving them demands and handing out the money, right? So I think that was kind of a, we'll see how it goes into the future. It's scaling back a little bit, and I think NRCan and industry and other departments are kind of going to be more in the front and center going forward in the new environment. That's the way I'm seeing it.
And there's the peril, right?
Yeah.
Anne, thank you.
Maybe just to build on those things, some fun facts from an old lady. Does anyone remember the 1 ton challenge from early 2000, right? So that was actually something to try to make it real to people, you know, reduce your emissions by 1 ton, and examples were given.
It was Rick Mercer, right?
A flight. Was it? Yeah, okay, yeah. And then it was derisively called the wonton challenge. So there could be disadvantages to rhyming too, right? And that underscores, I think, you know, what you were talking about, Derek, you know, economists have certain solutions, but, you know, we're not marketers, we're not necessarily behavioral economists or, you know, behavioral psychologists. And I think partnering, interdisciplinary partnering is just so important for that reason. Similarly, just talking about, I might be losing the thread now. The interdepartmental cooperation too, right? You know, there's organizational design considerations around that. Other countries do it differently. Denmark has all of their climate modeling and climate policy centralized in their finance department. And they're effective in that way. Estonia too, I think. And so that's, you know, institutional design, organizational psychology. That's a different skill set. And I'm going to be one of these jerks having a comment, not a question, but I do think that interdisciplinary, you know, communication and collaboration is just crucial.
So don't leave the economists on their own.
Don't leave us on our own. We geek out.
I think on the communications too, I don't know how you solve it, but I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories about when we got our refund checks for the fuel charge. And they were actual checks, we still get paper. And I went into my daughter's room, who was in undergrad at the time, starving student, and she said, "Oh, awesome, the government's giving me money." Then I went into the dining room where my wife, who's a kindergarten school teacher, was prepping for her class, and I gave her her check, and she said, "Why is the government trying to give us money?" So different reactions from different demographics and perspectives. Neither of them knew what they were getting the money for, just to be honest. So, like, I think communications experts should look back on, like, this is a great case study on how to market what should have been, like, kind of a no-brainer, right?
We have a bit of time left for another question or two.
Me again, sorry. So coming back to the point you made, Stephanie, about legislation and that only 2 laws connect climate and nature. I'm responsible for the Federal Sustainable Development Act, which is one of many acts that Parliament has passed to address these issues. But there is kind of a question about how many acts we should have, and you know, I don't even know what the status is. There was talk of a nature accountability bill before the last Parliament. So we have Federal Sustainable Development Act. We have which was originally the intention was very similar to what became the Net Zero, the SNESIA, the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. So a lot of acts. Any further thoughts on sort of the future of this of the legislative frameworks?
Yeah. So just a bit more context than I was able to give in my talk. I'm drawing on this from kind of a 2-year process we've been doing with Canada, US, Mexico. The US Congress, pre-Trump, commissioned a North American biodiversity and climate change assessment. So looking at primarily what are the climate impacts on biodiversity, but a little bit also looking in the other direction. How does biodiversity influence, how is biodiversity influenced by, say, climate mitigation technologies and stuff? So as the coordinating lead author for the Canadian policy chapter, we worked with law professors and did kind of an inventory of existing legislation in Canada and how much it's looking at these issues. And we don't need new legislation. The problem is that the legacy legislation, the big pieces of legislation which really dominate decision-making, the Fisheries Act, for instance, Navigable Waters Act, like you can go across the list. These are the big legacy legislations. They basically all need a retrofit. And that's when I think about that as somebody who worked on the Hill for a while, like that's a staggering agenda, but you can't kind of keep stacking on top of something that is structurally flawed to begin with. And all of those pieces of legislation are basically not fit for purpose for looking into like a 75-year adaptation window. And so we're just not bringing the right information into decision making. And I think it's like a bigger issue. I don't know if you can do an omnibus bill or something like that. I've kind of played a little bit trying to think about how you actually deal with it from a legislative perspective. But the issue is not the failure of new legislation. Most of it has been, in the very recent legislation, has actually been very progressive on this. It's that legacy legislation which is not being updated and it needs to be retrofitted.
Yeah, I think there's always, I'm not an expert in this area, but like there's always a tendency for the system to want new stuff, right? But like there's at least two acts, again, I'm not experts, but like the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Species at Risk Act that our department, falls under our department, that could, especially species at risk, but could use like some major improvements and overhauls, but I don't know. Nobody wants to like kind of fix the old car in the garage. It's like, let's buy a new shiny one. Sometimes is where the kind of policy development in the system kind of drives you to, right? So I don't think you need more legislation.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Building on the last question about regulation, you mentioned very clear how we're moving from well-known like mitigation policies to more adaptation now, and how we need to do it like more proactive, not as reactive. I'm wondering if the resilience concept is somehow the idea to getting into these adaptations, or is a new concept that we are not still there? How you see it in terms of policy level?
So I still think in a mitigation and an adaptation framework. Many of my colleagues challenge me on that because they say, no, you should be moving past it. I will say that the reason I still think in that framework is because the policy instruments, the stakeholders, the communities, the governance frameworks that are in place are extremely different between those two, I call them domains of climate. That doesn't mean that those domains shouldn't be thinking of each other as they're doing their practice. And in fact, there is huge opportunity as we do, say, the energy transition to improve resilience of our energy systems. There's also vulnerabilities potential as we go to, mass electrification. But we do have to be kind of thinking across those two domains very much, I think. And ultimately, it's about long-term resilience of society. And that's, obviously what climate mitigation is at its foundation. But I do think that it's harder when you actually get to actually trying to do applied policy to think that they're all one package. They really are dealing with kind of very different constituencies as you try to do the implementation.
I'll leave it to Stephanie on that.
Perfect. We actually have a few minutes more if there's another question. Yeah, Nicholas.
Maybe just a quick thought, and I wanted Stephanie to thank you for your question on the communication, the role of it, and I guess it's not a question, but along the sides of Anne here. For me, I had a personal experience a couple years back when I was traveling, and I met a Texan lady in a bar, and I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I work in the financial sector." I said, "Oh, well, me too. I work in collaboration with the finance sector." And she said, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, you're familiar with climate change." And then she got really worked up and said, "I don't believe in the climate hoax, and don't talk to me about this. I'm on vacation." I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I said, "Do you have children?" She said, I do. I said, "Well," in fact, she said, "I'm a grandmother." I said, "Do you like birds?" "I love birds." "Do you go in the forest?" "I do." I said, "Well, my job is to work with people like you to try to make sure that your granddaughter can still go and take a walk when she's older with her kids and listen to birds when she does that." She said, "When do we start? How can I help you?" So I think that whole issue of communication can be really powerful and needs to carefully be thought about when we try to convince people about a policy outcome that we're doing. So I just thought I'd share that little anecdote which sort of flipped a discourse in a matter of a minute. And I think a lot of attention needs to be put towards that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo that. And I think we've actually been at PICS, we've been kind of starting to wade into this communication issue a little bit. And one of the interesting things that's coming up is how much of the polling that's influencing climate communications, because of the way the poll structure is set up, is primarily polling urban populations. And so part of what's happening is that if you just look at, the percentage population, et cetera, they're trying to do representative samples, they're not picking up rural views are really discounted. And yet, if you think of it from a political perspective, all those ridings are not being represented. It's not about a population issue, it's about, huge ridings. And are there different ways of communicating different values that need to come into the climate conversation in order for it to resonate with rural populations, not just with, say, downtown Vancouver. So we're actually supporting some work right now that's doing deep work in northern BC, trying to understand, because we know that climate is actually something people care about, and yet it's also the center of a lot of the climate policy backlash that's happening in BC. There's something wrong with how that climate policy is being seen, what the value is, and it's not resonating with people's core values, which we know actually probably should be supporting it. We need to find different ways of talking about it. It's around exactly the type of things that you're talking about. What is the environment that people love? That's why they're living in those regions. That's why they want their grandchildren to live there. And it's a different issue than if you're in downtown Vancouver living in a condo building. And we need to think about that more in our communications.
Yeah, and just one last thought, and Texas kind of triggered that. There's actually, like in Alberta and renewables, there's actually like governments and organizations that are like trying to block things that are profitable and commercially viable and that people want to do. And my last anecdote will be reading in the Globe and Mail a few months ago about solar in Texas. And there was a farmer who was interviewed, and he said, "I don't really care about climate change. I don't know if it's real or not, but I'm making a lot of money putting these solar panels on my farm." So it's crazy that there actually a mindset of blocking the free market and things that like people want to do, frankly, just to make money because the economics are there, right? So I don't know. We need more. Do we need more communications people, or just better?
I also, just talking about communications, I think none of us should be naive about what's going on in the misinformation space. And, the climate misinformation space is deeply, deeply connected, according to researchers who are tracking it, to the whole destabilization of democracy. There's a bigger context that's happening here that is also surfacing in climate misinformation, and it's pretty dark and pretty powerful, and we shouldn't be naive about, where some of the pushback on climate policies is actually getting fermented.
All right, well, Lots of food for thought. And now for some food. Lunch is served just outside the doors. The lounge is open. Please circulate, meet someone new. We have a full hour for lunch, so please meet back here at 1:15. See you soon. Welcome back. I'm sorry to interrupt all the interesting conversations that I can hear bubbling through. But we've got lots of really interesting research to get through, so I'm just going to power through. We have an excellent afternoon lined up for you. The first session is on climate policy entity-level outcomes. The speakers for this session are Dr. Amr ElAlfy, Tia Driver from the University of Waterloo, Dr. Felix Fosu from Queen's University, and Anil Gogebakan from the University of Calgary. Professor ElAlfy's research focuses on exploring the dynamics of sustainability, shedding light on non-financial reporting practices, and interpreting the materiality of sustainability risks and opportunities for investors. Tia is a PhD candidate in sustainability management, and her doctoral research focuses on the materiality of climate change risks in corporate disclosures and the implications for financial performance. Tia and Amr will be presenting findings from their project assessing Canadian firms' readiness for climate disclosures. After them will be Felix. He is a postdoctoral fellow. His research examines economic policy uncertainty, firms' investment decisions, and patterns of international trade. And his project is titled The External Impacts of Green Energy Policy, Evidence from Imported Inputs at the Canadian Firm Level. And then we'll have a third presenter, Anil. He is a PhD candidate in economics. His research interests concentrate on the intersection of international trade, environmental and energy economics with a special focus on air pollution. And he will share his findings from energy efficiency and productivity in Canada. Thank you.
Hello everyone and good afternoon. My name is Anil ElAlfy. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at SEED. And today we are sharing our funded project from SPI on assessing the Canadian firm's readiness for climate disclosure. Before we start our presentation, we just want to have like a small land acknowledgement that all the work that we're doing at the University of Waterloo exists on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. This land is part of the Haldeman Tract, which was promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Okay, let's jump into the research. So in previous presentations, people were saying like academics and practitioners. I'm not a typical academic. Before being in academia, I was the sustainability manager for Nestle and then for 3M, and I decided to leave the industry because all the reporting frameworks that we were doing was not efficient. We were actually saying, we will achieve net zero, and then in Fund 6, we were not able to achieve our net zero targets. Okay, like all the reports in Fund 12 and in Fund 6, we would say that. And all my previous research was on the S&P 500. Why? Easier to publish, data sets are complete, things are perfect. And then I decided, so let's do work on the TSX firms. That's going to be the coming project. And as we were working on the TSX, I called a lot of my practitioners, friends in the back. How is like the reporting landscape happening? And they're like, they said a bad word, teet. Every day we wake up with a new reporting standard. When I was working there, there was the Global Reporting Initiative, which was doing like kind of the impact materiality, the economic, environmental, and the social pieces. SASB came in 2011 with the financial materiality, what it means for the risks to investors. And then Europe came in with like kind of the CSRDs on the double materiality. And every day they wake up with a new regulation. Oh, stop. SASB and integrated reporting, the joint ventures under the Value Reporting Foundation, and now they're integrating into the ISSB. Okay, are we disclosing according to the ISSB? No, we're Canada. We're going to have the CSSB. Okay, so what's different? This is like a big unknown uncertainty in the disclosure landscape. Last week, So I'm also part of another project, like with Amelia Clark on an NZAP, and that's according to Canadian municipalities. And they need to disclose according to the IP-SASB. And in the IP-SASB, like in the presentation, so people were saying, are we disclosing according to the financial materiality of SASB and like CSSB, or to the impact materiality of GRI? And they said, we have our own definition of materiality. We are going to address the financial materiality of the financial sector, and also have the impact materiality of the other frameworks. So this part was so undefined. So we want to jump into the literature and evaluate the readiness of Canadian firms for the new climate-related disclosure requirements. And we wanted to examine how materiality, how climate risk materiality is conceptualized, both in the accounting domain and the sustainability domain. And the amazing Tia, I call her like the amazing Tia because the fund from SPI, and thank you like Marina, Mariana, and Jeff for the funding. There was like 3 papers out of this, a policy brief, and a blog. So like, thank you seriously for the funding, and that was in combination with a SHRC Insights Development Grant through this project. And that is what the first part where we did an integrative literature review, and Tia was like, I don't want to do like a normal systematic literature review. I want to do an integrative literature. This will not be published, Tia. No, it will be published, but let's do a good. So it's under review at the moment. And she was like, I will do the 6 scattered research areas and do an integrative literature review. That's for the first question on how the concept of risk materiality is conceptualized both in accounting and the research, sustainability research. And then the second part, through the TSX firms, we did like content analysis for the reports, and here we'll talk about the sample of how the firm reporting practices. And I want just to give a hint at the difference between reporting and disclosure. So we would see that Canadian firms, unfortunately, right now they're not disclosing. They are reporting. So in the back end, all like scope 3 accounting, like the upstream and the downstream is happening, but because of Bill C-59, because of the new regulations, people are saying, wait until we see like the best format, then we're going to disclose. So that's like something that's really hindering the disclosure landscape in Canada. So the contribution of the research that was funded we advanced the fragmented literature to highlight the importance of materiality and how corporations can consider materiality when preparing their climate disclosure reports. And we highlighted a huge incident happening in Canadian firms about a double materiality washing. So they are like mentioning double materiality, and they're using CSSB or like or SASB, which couldn't be the case, and Tia will like elaborate more on that. And we're suggesting areas for improvement beyond just mere compliance. How can like the disclosure, like a report is not the goal. The report is a tool of communication between the firm and their stakeholders and rights holders. So right now it's not just the stakeholders, because we need to include the rights holders and the stakeholders in corporations for the people, by the people. And finally, we identified the decoupling between the double materiality and the climate-related topics that were disclosed in the Canadian reports. Tia, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Amr. I just want to switch this. I got the clicker this time. We're good. Okay. So before we get into talking about paper 1 and paper 2, I do want to just quickly explain what materiality is in the context of reporting. We talked about circular economy in the morning, and sometimes the words materiality gets confused between what we do and that type of research. So for disclosure and climate reporting, materiality is used as a fundamental principle to help firms determine what information they should disclose publicly. There are 2 types of materiality: financial materiality, which is concerned with the financial implications of external risks on the company's enterprise value. And then there's impact materiality, which focuses on how companies impact society and the natural environment. These 2 types can be applied from 2 different perspectives, just to make it a little more complicated. The first is a single materiality perspective, which means the firm's only applying either financial or impact. Typically, it's financial materiality. And the second, which is a more recent development, is called double materiality, where firms are using both impact and financial materiality within their disclosures to help provide, hopefully, a more fuller picture of their impact and risks. But this is still relatively new, and it's not as widely adopted as a single financial materiality perspective. So with that in mind, we conducted research paper 1, which was that integrative literature review. We ended up reviewing 140 peer-reviewed articles and came up with 12 interconnecting themes organized around 6 core concepts. This project was undertaken because the accounting, management, and climate disclosure literature areas are rather fragmented, and they haven't fully accounted or explored how materiality factors into their research and across different research disciplines. So it's kind of like, the integrated literature review is kind of like a systematic review, except we are actually looking to integrate and connect through a conceptual map, which is the key outcome from paper 1. So within this conceptual model, we can see that the 12 themes, which are in the black boxes, and the 6 core research concepts or research areas are in the white boxes. We see that materiality is at the center of this model, and it connects firms' climate disclosures to stakeholder expectations and financial considerations, but disclosures are also shaped by stakeholder interests offering potential financial benefits, but also involve trade-offs financial trade-offs specifically, that need to be accounted for in materiality decision-making. So at the end, materiality helps connect the corporate reporting and the disclosures back to the larger systemic issues of climate change risks as well as economic stability, which in turn feeds back into the financial performance of firms. So this model's a little bit messy, and that's because the world is messy and materiality is at the core of it when we start to look at climate disclosures. So when we started thinking about readiness for reporting, we went back to the literature review and pulled out 4 key insights that might be relevant to this topic. So first, climate disclosure is not merely a compliance exercise, it also creates strategic value. By participating in climate disclosures, firms have the opportunity to build new internal capacities or find internal resources to tackle external risks, such as climate change. Second, disclosures reflect corporate interests, stakeholder needs, and political agendas, meaning that even a double materiality perspective, which is supposed to include both financial and non-financial impacts, can vary widely depending on how firms prioritize stakeholders and those impacts themselves. Third, climate change disclosure can create both strategic opportunities and financial trade-offs. Evidence within the study has shown mixed financial outcomes for firms that engage in climate reporting. So proactive risk management can still nonetheless help firms reduce exposure to climate-related financial losses or other financially related issues, but you have to engage proactively. You can't just be a reactive reporting firm. And finally, stakeholders play a central but disproportionate role in the shaping of climate disclosures. Climate reports are intended to inform a wider range of stakeholders, but firms tend to prioritize specific stakeholder groups who have the most influence, which has typically been investors. This leads to selective reporting or omission of unfavorable information, which raises concerns about greenwashing and the reliability of these public reports. As such, disclosure patterns often reflect strategic choices rather than a holistic account of climate risks. So taken together, the insights from paper 1 suggest that assessing reporting readiness in Canada requires looking beyond formal compliance and to understand how materiality perspectives, stakeholder pressures, and strategic choices shape the quality and consistency of climate disclosures. So from paper 1, we realized we need something that's a little more tangible, like empirical-wise. So we conducted paper 2, which did a content analysis of the 2023 sustainability reports from 142 TSX-listed firms on the 250 index. So we did the directed content analysis, which means we code and we looked for 9 specific topics, climate-related risk topics, which we selected based on previous literature. And we also then coded firms as being either double or single materiality, depending on the materiality statements in the reports. After the content analysis, we applied theory, because you should, and we decided that we were going to use signaling theory, which helps us to kind of explain why companies disclose what they do and the way they do it. It is more of like a communication style theory, and we operationalized it under a composite index, so a composite scoring called the signal fit index, and that just helps us measure the alignment between the firm's materiality statements and the topics they disclose. We then did a regression with the signal fit index onto the double materiality variable, which is equivalent to the single materiality in the way we coded it, controlling for industry using an ordinary least squares model, so a regression model. From there, we just have some quick descriptive statistics. So of the 142 sampled firms, 37% applied a double materiality perspective, while 63 used single materiality. Across nearly all disclosures, though, all disclosure topics, all 9 topics, firms adopting a double materiality perspective tended to report more frequently than those that applied single materiality. Yet, when we just look at the total sample, so the furthest column there, we see that the short-term and long-term risks mapping, that's those 2 specific topics, were only disclosed by 13% of firms, which is much lower than the 37%, just making sure it's coming through, 37% of firms that reported using scenario analysis or conducting scenario analysis, which is interesting because scenario analysis typically requires considering multiple time horizons. As well, when we see that 60% of the firms disclose their climate risk identification methods, so this means how they identify climate risks and determine if they're relevant, we see that even fewer provide details on the actual risks themselves, with only 58% of the sample describing physical risks and 54% describing transition risks. These patterns indicate that there's several critical climate components missing that remain underreported within Canadian firms, or Canadian listed firms, I should say. So when we look at industries themselves, we had 11 industries with variable representation, but even still, we see that only 3 out of the 11 provided disclosure on all 9 topics. So there is room for improvement in terms of disclosure at the industry level. In terms of the regression analysis, we find no statistical significance in the association between the adoption of a single or double materiality perspective and their signal fit score, which means materiality is not correlated with firms' disclosure practices and appearing not to be a major influencer on why firms disclose the 9 topics, even though theoretically it should have some sort of influence. This means that the sample firms are not providing substantive disclosures and potentially using materiality statements themselves as a greenwashing tactic. In sum, these findings indicate that many firms appear underprepared to meet more rigorous climate disclosure requirements emerging under the new reporting standards in terms of ISSB or CSSB or whatever standard is going to come out first. So to conclude the presentation itself, the research so far, because we've only finished paper 1 and paper 2, key outcomes are materiality perspectives may shape climate risk disclosure, but they do not fully determine disclosure practices, as we've seen in the empirical evidence. Materiality statements do not necessarily translate into coherent and climate disclosures, meaning there is a disconnect between what firms say they base their reports on, what their foundational principles are, and what they actually disclose. And finally, strengthening climate disclosure readiness requires aligning materiality with the actual content of disclosures, meaning we need clearer guidance for firms on how to integrate, understand, and then finally report based on a materiality perspective, whether it's a single or double. Anything else you want to add?
Just like kind of one last thing, since we have like kind of John Cameron from CSSB, there is like there is a huge need in Canada for harmonization. Sorry, if you don't come to the microphone, okay. So like kind of the last comment is the strategic need for harmonization, as like kind of the previous presentation that there's lack of standardization. We need the standardization. Like the industry really are looking for what should I do and how should I do it right. So the lack of guidance, too many frameworks is actually not helping, is actually distracting the industry. And Canada needs to understand what do we need to have with a proper stakeholder engagement and rights holder engagement that goes just beyond the financial like privilege for shareholders. It has to have like kind of a whole descriptive, a whole process of materiality when we are setting the prioritization in climate disclosure and climate risks. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thank you everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for having us here. So this paper is a joint work with Wenshan, who is currently with the University of Calgary. We've changed the title of the paper a little bit, but the research question basically remains the same. So the idea about this paper is that we wanted to ask two key questions. The first one is we were curious about if Canada were to increase the air quality standard, would that kind of push firms to buy things from outside versus probably producing them in Canada or probably buying them from Canada? And would those goods be coming from countries that have similar energy profiles as Canada, but compared to probably coming from more dirtier destinations? So those were the two main questions that kind of inspired this research. Air quality standards have become one of the important policy tools in global energy issues in the fight against carbon emissions. And basically the idea is that if we could impose those kind of constraints or cost on producers, that will probably incentivize them to adopt cleaner energies. But in theory, that could also result in some kind of unintended consequences. It may push firms to buy things from outside versus buying from inside, or probably it will get them to exit the market altogether if the cost is too much. So basically the outcome of those kind of regulations at the end of the day is going to be determined by how firms do adjust. So basically in the context of Canada, Canada had one of those hallmark policies in 2000 where they kind of had this Canada-wide emission program. And one study has found that this reduced nearly 40% of manufacturing emissions. So that was a very good outcome if you think about how these policies work. But unfortunately, the study also finds that this decline in emission is purely due to reduction in output. So the firms just reduce their value added. And so our goal is to kind of think of, is this reduction in value added because firms are sourcing things from outside instead of producing from Canada? So that is our research question. And basically we are going to use the same kind of policy. So in 2000, Canada adopted these Canada-wide standards for PM and ozone. These were the targets for PM and ozone. So any region, basically the regions with CMA and CS, if they go past these thresholds, then they face some kind of stricter pollution rules. So we are going to kind of think about if a firm, oh sorry, how do I kind of get this? So if thank you. So if a firm is within this region, so these regions are going to be the regions that kind of exceeded this threshold within the time period that we do this study. If you take a firm within these regulated regions, would their emission import intensities change relative to the period in which they were not facing those kind of stricter regulations? So that is the kind of firms that we are going to try to include in our analysis. And basically the unshaded areas are going to be the control groups, the firms that never had to deal with this kind of stricter regulations. Okay. So thankfully to Statistics Canada, we have a very comprehensive data of all enterprises that are in Canada. So we could basically look at almost every firm. So our baseline analysis is going to focus on manufacturers, and we had about 25,000 of them in the data set. And then we'll combine that with the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program, which is also going to give us data on how regions are doing in terms of their PM and O3 emissions. So we'll combine these two data sets with some econometric techniques. We came out with these results. So I'm only going to focus on the one in the column 1. So basically the results in column 1 is we're looking at firms, manufacturers use input. Those input could either be produced by those manufacturers, they could buy them from Canada, or they could buy them from outside. So our goal here is what percentage of those inputs are coming from outside, and how does that change when firms face stricter regulations? So this coefficient here is highly statistically significant, 0.487. And to put that in perspective, it means that if you take a firm that previously was importing, let's say 10% of their imports from outside, Then when they face those stricter regulations, they will now import about 15%. And that is a huge number if you put that into that perspective. So that is what our results tells us, and we studied this based on, as I said, about 25,000 manufacturing firms in Canada. Okay, and then so this is the event study for those that care about pre and post trends, econometrics. Here, so on the right here, the figure there is looking at the extensive margin, which is basically what is the probability that a firm, when faced with those stricter regulations, will start importing things from outside. So here the average is about 5%. So the probability of a typical firm choosing to buy from outside when they face those stricter regulations goes up by 5%. And that is also a huge number if you put that into perspective. So that is our baseline results, and we also find a lot of heterogeneous results, which might also be important when you think about this in terms of the policy framework. The first one is that we find that all these effects that I showed you are driven by exporters. So it's the firms that face foreign competition in terms of selling goods outside. Those are the firms that are more likely to react in terms of choosing to buy from outside. And it makes sense because for those firms, cost is very important if they want to remain competitive in the outside market. So we do see that all these effects are generated among firms that also do business outside. Multi-establishment firms respond less, and probably because they are able to relocate some of these production across locations. Small and also less productive firms drive all the extensive margin results. So the probability, this effect here is mostly driven by small and less productive firms who previously wouldn't buy things because doing trade or buying things from outside is mostly requires a lot of fixed costs. So these firms would otherwise not, but when they face those kind of stricter regulations, they may now choose to buy things from outside. The new importers, we also find that this could probably, thankfully, come from high-income countries. So countries that probably have the same carbon and energy profiles as that of Canada. Probably they could be dirtier than Canada, but we are yet to look into those, the energy profiles of these countries. But we see that it's mostly countries that are in the OECD. And then we also see some kind of spillover effect in the resale and also the wholesale, in the retail and the wholesale sector. So we also look at our baseline results. The one that I showed you was from manufacturers, but we also kind of look at how the effect was for other sectors. And then two that also stands out in terms of the magnitude of their effect is the wholesale and then the retail sectors. So for the wholesale, we tend to find about, so in the manufacturing, the effect was like if it's 40% increase in import. For wholesale, it's about 20%, and for retail, it's about 8% or something. Increase in import when they face those kind of regions that face this kind of stricter regulations. So we think that this resource would have some kind of policy implications. And the first one that we can think of is how we are thinking about how carbon emissions travel across borders. We think that when one country unilaterally imposes this kind of regulations, that could also push emissions across borders, and that is exactly what we see in this project, even though they are coming from countries that probably have the same kind of energy profiles as Canada, but still there is pollution happening elsewhere, instead of probably the firms investing in those cleaner energies so that we don't have to import carbon as well. we think our results will also have impact for implication on this emerging policy, which is the border carbon adjustment, which is thinking about how we should treat importers and exporters. So our research has found that it's the exporters who are also doing the import. And that is going to kind of shape the way we should think about this carbon border adjustment, which is thinking about how we should treat importers versus exporters. So finding that these importers are also the exporters, I think that is also going to shape the way we think and also talk about these policies. And lastly, we think that our results also implies that there has to be a coordinated climate policies in the way that we will be able to avoid this pollution haven effect, where trying to reduce emission in one country will cause probably large-scale emissions in other parts of the globe. So, yeah, thank you for your time.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizers. Thanks for having me here. I am Anil Gogebakan. I am a research associate at Cardiff Business School and Wales Productivity Forum, and I am in the process of wrapping up my PhD at the University of Calgary in economics. So that goes without saying, I believe this project has been funded by Smart Prosperity Institute. Thank you, I acknowledge. And today, I'm gonna talk about energy efficiency and productivity. To set up the stage, I will start with the kind of definition. So our living standards are largely determined by productivity, meaning that productivity is the output per input that we used. And we observe big productivity differences across the different jurisdictions and different countries. And most of these productivity differences are due to inefficient use of our resources or inputs. So that means how we use our inputs are setting our living standards. Then if our inputs doesn't go to their most productive uses, I'm gonna call these misallocation. If things that are preventing these inputs flowing to their most productive uses, I'm gonna call them distortions. There could be many ways of distortions. Basically, I am having policy making in my mind, so taxation, regulation, energy policy, etc. I'm asking the question in this paper that is our spending, the money that goes into the energy, is maximizing our income. So I take energy as an essential input to our production. It is nearly like everywhere in the economy. We need energy to produce. And in Canada, our provinces have different regulation and different energy policy. Provinces and sectors are facing different energy prices due to infrastructure, regulation, energy policy, and things like that. I'm asking, do these price differences that we create causing the productivity to be lower? And if so, by how much lower? Then I follow up with another question that how do these reductions from energy is comparing to those that is coming from the capital and labor misallocation, which are considered to be the primary inputs to production. So why energy is important in this context? So energy policy is not only about emissions. Maybe we are having in mind that it's related to emissions. It's also related to productivity. And energy policy is different across our provinces. I think that's clear. If energy cannot go to their most productive units, our output will be lower. So in Canada, we have the ambitious climate policy to reduce the emissions, but our productivity growth is struggling. So energy in this context is unique in several ways. So energy is less mobile, meaning that our infrastructure, electricity grid or the pipeline, like setting them up is very costly, and we are restricted to provide the energy to the like specific locations, okay? So price differences would be persistent, and if there is a global shock to energy prices, and we are gonna feel it right away in the domestic economy, it is a bit different than capital and labor. Your wage doesn't change overnight if there's something happening outside. It takes years. But energy, it's kind of overnight. Then you take this negative or positive shock to here. And it is very difficult and costly to store the electricity. That is meaning that we need to produce the electricity and consume the electricity at the same time. That is causing some the peak hours, the demand-driven like price volatility. So why I focus on Canada and why province sector level rather than firm level? So Canada gives us nice data, provincial input-output tables. So, and the provinces are differing in their energy policy, significantly different. Then we observe a high variation in energy prices and different decarbonization policy, etc. And then we have a vast geography and we have the infrastructure bottlenecks that causes the interprovincial trade to be quite limited because we have different standards. So the spatial dimension is really important. There is the persistent spatial misallocation as well. So there are like Canada-specific studies finding 3 to 7% productivity loss due to the internal trade frictions. So I calculated like Canada's economy, like how much we use labor, capital, or energy. Canada is mainly like service-based, I can say. We use labor, we spend on labor a lot, and then capital, these are the primary, and then energy is less than 10%. Although energy in the input cost share is like small, I'm gonna show that energy is contributing a lot to the productivity loss. That's kind of the main finding in this paper. So to preview the results, like I find that about like 5 to 8% potential productivity loss overall. I am using that specific years due to data availability. You can extend back and forth. In the model that I use, I can cleanly decompose by province sector level. When I do that, I see that most of the loss is coming from interprovincial frictions. And I can do like further down to input level. When I do the input level, I see capital is dominating the contribution of the productivity loss. And the energy is ranked as second, although it has less than 10% in the input share, like input cost share. And labor seems to be more optimal allocated across provinces and sectors. It's contributing less than 1%. So why energy matters? So it is like less than 10% of our cost, but it is accounting for 1/3 of what I estimate as the productivity loss. So per dollar, energy misallocation is generating larger productivity losses than those that is coming from capital and labor misallocation. So energy misallocation, so we need to pay attention to that in this context. And the contribution of this paper is, this is the first comprehensive estimate of productivity loss that's coming from energy misallocation in Canada at sector by province level. So I focus on energy as a key input and show that it has a disproportionately large effect on the productivity loss. I argue that it's equally important to capital and labor, which you consider that they are the primary inputs. Then I argue it's even more important in this context. We need to pay attention to energy. And I also add a special dimension by paying attention to the provincial dimension. It is kind of rare in this in this literature. And I connect two different literature. One is the concerning about the productivity and output gaps. The other is concerned about the climate goals and the lower emissions. Then I argue that if you use your energy in an optimal way, you can get your productivity higher and emissions lower in a sense. So data is coming from StatScan, and I understand money spent on energy sectors is the input, money going to capital, money going to labor is our inputs. So I will pass that part. Conceptually, what I do is, intuition is, in an efficient economy, I expect the inputs are used where they generate their highest value. But in practice, it doesn't work that way due to many regulation and policy. So input prices differ across the units like province and sectors here. As a result, I see the similar sectors with similar technologies use energy in different amounts. So these differences make economy operate below its full potential. So in terms of method, I compare the observed actual productivity that I calculate from the data to a benchmark where I consider the productivity is maximized theoretically. So in the benchmark, each additional input, I call it marginal revenue of the input, each additional input gives me the same value in each province sector cell. If these are equalized, then the productivity will be maximized. So these allocates inputs based on the value that they create. So inputs should flow to the province and sectors where they create their highest value. So when the same input generates different values across the units, it's misallocation. The larger the difference, the bigger the problem is. So in terms of model, this analysis is building on Sheikh-Lenov's seminal work in 2009. They have the capital and labor only in manufacturing sector and firm level data. I naturally extend by adding the energy and zooming out to province and sector. Then my distortions are operating by province and sector. So these distortions are reflecting the difference in policy, price, infrastructure, whatever we do as policy. So this model is allowing for the clean decomposition. Then I can talk about interprovincial effects and intersectoral effects. So here I am showing the marginal revenue products that is coming from each input for the beginning and end of the sample. When you look at the distribution, the spread over the distribution, the bigger the misallocation and bigger the productivity loss. When you look at labor, which is the green one, to 2014 and 2020, it is basically more relatively better allocated. But when you look at capital and labor, blue and the red ones, they are spread over. If they are spread over, that means they are contributing to the productivity loss a lot. When you check the capital from 2014 to 2020, when you check the variance, it's improving. Variance is getting lower. But when you look at the energy, energy is kind of stable. Energy is persistently causing more productivity loss. And I do this for the province level as well, for the beginning and end of the sample. To the left panel, it's the beginning of the sample. I rank the provinces based on their variance or standard deviation, you may call it. And I see that Ontario, Quebec, and BC ranked the most efficiently allocating their resources. And when you look at the second one, you see some improvement in the Alberta and BC when you check the numbers. And Ontario and Quebec are having the best allocation. And New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan are persistently having higher misallocation. I am here, sorry about that. So, so these are the results, full results, from beginning and all years. And in the first row, I show that how much the total misallocation is causing the productivity loss in terms of percentage. I see an improvement, 8% to 5% is going down. But then I can decompose, you can look at the bold ones, between sector and within sector misallocation. These two rows should sum up to the row in the first one. When you compare these two, then you see always the within sector one, within sector misallocation is more than the between sector one. That means interprovincial frictions is driving up the productivity loss that I estimate. More than half is coming through interprovincial frictions. That's the first main result. The second main result, if you go further down to like capital, labor, and energy, each input, then you see capital and energy is quite comparable in terms of their contribution to the productivity loss, and labor is contributing the lowest amount. It's because their variance was higher, so energy ranks second. So to conclude, my takeaways is total productivity loss coming from capital, labor, and energy, all misallocation, is 5 to 8%. And most of these loss is coming from interprovincial frictions. That's kind of the differences in the standard, internal trade, like standard differences and the regulation, etc. And energy is accounting for up to 1/3 of the loss, which is making it big, although it is input cost share is less than 10%. Labor is the most efficient allocated one. Then I suggest you can coordinate your energy policy and you can integrate the market to get a larger productivity gains. At the same time, you can get a low emissions. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, I think we win the award for smallest stage ever. But we're making it work. We're making it work. Questions? Yes, John.
Hi. Yes, John Cameron from the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Thank you very much for the presentations. I had a question for the first presentation on your literature review. You had takeaway 1 noted that climate disclosure was a strategic imperative for firms, but on takeaway 3, you noted that there were mixed results for firms that were disclosing climate, that were entering into climate disclosure, mixed financial performance. Can you kind of unpack that and how it can be a strategic imperative on one hand, yet lead to mixed financial performance results?
No, we did slightly talk about this last night. So the mixed results were interesting because when the literature was discussing financial performance, they looked at it from multiple views. So they would either look at it from return on assets, they look at market price or stock price, they looked at Z scores. There's many different ways that the financial impact was being measured. And because of that, it's hard to compare those results, meaning that the financial impacts would vary depending on which variable you were looking at. So it is a strategic value because yes, it does connect, disclosures do connect to financial performance, but it's also a communication tool to improve transparency and credibility within the broader economy and society by businesses. So it is a bit of a dual aspect when we think about why firms disclose and why they should disclose. There's that financial value to it, but there's also that non-financial value that comes through as well. Did you want to add anything, Emmer?
Yeah, I want to add something not just for the results, but for the conceptual understanding of materiality. And I'm going to jump into the new mandate for biodiversity valuation. And I think that like CPA 2.0 has a mandate that all accountants need to understand, natural capital accounting and social capital accounting. For the CSSB, how can you, Cameron, differentiate between the natural capital without the social? This is where, seriously, to the CSSB, as a reporting person, I want to make sure that the natural capital and the social capital are related. A 2x4 from a specific land versus a 2x4 from an indigenous land, will you put the same dollar value on them? Do they have the same economics on that is going to be $2? It's going to be the same $2? Or that social impact is actually impacting the environmental and the natural asset capital in this stage. This is where double materiality, this understanding, and we should start by the financial materiality, in terms of understanding what's actually material for investors. But it's not just about investors. The fact that we would say the users are just investors, this is where we're seeing this double materiality washing without actually integrating sincerely on the other needs of disclosure from various stakeholders and rights holders.
Just to summarize what Amber was saying and tying it a bit back to that financial performance, it really depends on what you want to know about financial performance and narrowing down on that. And then perhaps you could potentially find a positive influence of climate risk disclosure or negative, as some other reports have found. I'll be more than happy if you want to just connect. I can pull out the reports related to that mixed reporting and send those to you if you're interested.
Yeah, Valerie, do you have a question?
This is for Anil. Could you help me understand by giving me either a real example or a hypothetical example of what it would look like in Canada if we were using energy in the most efficient way to increase productivity? Because it was quite a key line that you said a few times, and I'd love to have an understanding of what that would look like.
Thank you for your question. So whatever I have in my mind is not a specific one. I'm just suggesting that if you could have the exact same standards across the provinces and across the sectors, that would kind of eliminate the distortions that's causing the misallocation. That I am estimating that 1/3 of whatever we are losing is coming through energy misallocation. Then we can easily achieve we can easily deal with the 1/3 of our loss by just setting the same standard. And since the interprovincial frictions is causing the main one, then I would say that setting the same standards to import and export products across the provinces would solve most of the problem. And then second, we can harmonize across the provinces because it is significantly different if I look at the decarbonization policies, etc. So I wouldn't know specifically what exact differences are there. Probably people in the room would know better than me. So I just suggest coordination. So yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, up here.
Thank you. I have a question from the last presentation. My question is, based on your presentation, we know there are most barrier we are facing right now. First is the disconnection in the provincial government level. The second is depend on the product value. So my question is it possible for Canada to have a unified framework in policy to do this? Because not only in this area, I believe in other areas, we all facing the same questions. So is it possible? How to conquer it? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. So I believe I am not sure about the feasibility of how you harmonize the energy policy across the provinces. I just see, I say what I see, the provinces are very different. Probably many people in the room would be better informed if it is feasible to make at least similar energy policies, similar decarbonization policies across the provinces. Would it be possible? So I wouldn't know. I'm not a policymaker. Maybe somebody wants to take the microphone and answer. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks for the presentations. Just a quick question for Felix. I'm curious about the data you used. Can you see where these imports are coming from, which countries they're coming from the data? Because I think it'll be not, for this paper necessary, but if you could think of an extension, there's a lot of, the pollution haven literature that looks at what happens to developing countries when developed countries establish strict regulation on pollution and they end up being affected negatively. So I was just wondering if you can see that through the data at all.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, the data set is very detailed, so we can see for each firm, we can see the countries, the top 3 countries where your imports are coming from. So yeah, so that is where we are going next. We want to dive into that to see the energy profiles of those countries, how dirty they are, and then we will be able to kind of analyze this effect. But I mean, the key thing is how it's very difficult to kind of merge external data set with that of Statistics Canada. But we are working on that. But yeah, that is very doable. Yeah.
one last question, Stephanie.
Thanks. Just, Anil, a question to you again. I'm just trying to think about like what the response to that can be. And I'm struggling with understanding, is an issue about the physical flow of energy in across the country? So for instance, is it an infrastructure issue if we had east-west transmission corridors, for instance, or better pipelines across the country? So is it an infrastructure issue that would stabilize kind of costs and prices across the country, or is it kind of more of a market issue because we've got very different institutions making pricing policy province by province? Is it provincially regulated, and they operate on very different philosophies? So like, what is the solution set here? Is it in the physical domain, or is it in the policy domain?
Thank you. That's a very great question. I really appreciate that. So the infrastructure is kind of costly to make electricity grid or pipeline if you think there's a cost to that. So I wouldn't suggest going with improving the infrastructure, and it's a vast geography and infrastructure. You have whatever you have. But the best thing, the main difference, I think, is coming from differently setting your like carbon prices, decarbonization, and you are taking a different angle of how you reduce your emissions. I think it's related to market and how you make your decisions to reduce the emissions. If everyone does this in a federal level instead of the provincial level, has a lot of flexibility and a lot of independence from federal policy, I think that is the sort of the problem. The interprovincial one, I think if you set the same standards for energy or whatever you are importing, for example, this laptop, if this laptop in Ontario, it says it has to be 35 or whatever key has to be here. If BC says 34, there is nothing wrong with 35 or 34. You can't just simply transfer this product from Ontario to BC, right? Just a different standard. Just if you get the same standard, if you agree on one thing, whatever this thing, it could be anything, it would remove the most of the problem. But infrastructure, there should be cost-benefit analysis needed to understand how much a pipeline would cost to us, how much an electricity grid would cost us, then how much benefit I will get. So I wouldn't go with infrastructure. I would go with just harmonizing same policy, federal level, maybe uniform. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anil, Felix, Tia, and Amr. We're going to do our last break of the day. Please meet back here in 15 minutes at 2:30. All right, welcome back, everyone. To round out this day of fascinating research, we have two presentations on the topic of a just energy transition, the role of policy. I'm pleased to present two graduate students from Simon Fraser University, Piper French and Sarah Ozog. Piper is working towards her Master's of Resource Management, and her research focuses on how Canadian policy supports or creates barriers for Indigenous environmental justice in critical mineral development. Her project is titled Critical Justice: Understanding Indigenous Peoples' Role in Energy Transition Mineral Development in Canada. Sarah is also a student at SFU's School of Resource and Environmental Management. Her research focuses on the coexistence of climate policy and multi-level government commitments to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Her project is Reconciliation and Decarbonization Policy Integration, Opportunities in the Haida Gwaii Energy Transition. And I'll get off the stage and pass it over to Piper.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday afternoon. My name is Piper French, as Mariana was saying. I'm a second-year Master of Resource and Environmental Management student at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and my supervisors are Dr. Andréan Doyon and Jonathan Boron. And so the title is kind of a work in progress, but my current working one is Critical Justice: Interrogating Canada's Critical Mineral Policy Regime for a Just Energy Transition. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this research was conducted on the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations in what's commonly called Burnaby Mountain in British Columbia. And I also want to recognize that I'm coming to this research as a non-Indigenous person of settler descent, and to acknowledge not just the privilege that comes along with being a settler, but also the responsibility that comes with it as well. And then I want to recognize that I'm presenting today on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And this is my first time being here on this territory, so I'm very grateful to be here, and it's nice to see some snow. I'm coming from a very mild Vancouver. And so I'll start by explaining kind of the context shaping this research, and then I'll get into my policy analysis framework and how I developed it. I'll get into the framework itself, and then I'll talk about what my policy analysis looks like going forward, and then I'll, of course, provide some conclusion and takeaways. And so I'm sure everyone in this room is well aware that addressing climate change will require a transition from fossil fuel-based energy towards renewable and low-carbon energy. However, for the critical mineral enthusiasts in the room that already know this, renewable energy is much more mineral intensive than traditional energy sources. And so the increase in global production of renewable energy is also leading to an increased demand for critical minerals that are then required to produce renewable energies like solar panels and wind turbines. As example, according to the International Energy Agency, meeting the Paris Agreement's climate goals would mean a quadrupling of mineral requirements for clean energy technologies by 2040. And so although the definition of what makes a mineral critical does vary between countries, two common ways of assessing criticality are through a mineral supply risk as well as the economic importance. There are, of course, other uses for critical minerals beyond renewable energy, but my research is focused on energy transitions in particular, so I'll be talking from that perspective. And so to address the precarious position that many critical minerals have in the global supply chain, as well as to take advantage of global demand, countries are engaging in this race to secure or expand domestic supply where possible. And in many cases, countries are relying on fast-tracking projects in order to hasten mineral extraction. And so this increased pressure is causing concern among Indigenous peoples especially, who experience the effects of extraction disproportionately. And so Canada is among the countries, of course, seeking to expand domestic production and extraction of critical minerals. Several jurisdictions have created critical mineral strategies to outline how critical mineral development will be approached and supported to meet increasing demands. However, as a settler colonial country, all critical mineral projects that are occurring in Canada are also occurring on Indigenous land. And we know that extractive projects like mines have had detrimental social and environmental effects for Indigenous communities, with different environmental injustices having occurred throughout the process, whether it's exclusion from decision making or failing to consider the full effects that these projects have on local communities and their obligations to more than humans. And so this context has led me to my primary research question, asking what does Indigenous environmental justice look like in the context of critical mineral development in Canada? And so to answer this question, we need to understand how the current energy transition is impacting Indigenous peoples in settler colonial contexts specifically. And so in answering this secondary research question, I developed a qualitative analytical framework that can then be used to analyze critical mineral strategies. And so this framework was developed from a systematic literature review that I conducted of 3 literature bodies, which were Just Energy Transitions, Critical Minerals, and Indigenous Environmental Justice. And so I started with a literature search across these bodies and refined the results down to 140 articles for Just Energy Transitions, 41 for Critical Minerals, and 42 for Indigenous Environmental Justice. And so once I had these articles, I then conducted 3 rounds of thematic coding in NVivo, which led to the creation of around 155 codes. And so once this coding was completed, I then conducted a thematic analysis. And so this involved determining higher level themes for each literature body, such as economics or the effects of critical mineral extraction, fast tracking, etc., for the critical mineral literature body, for example. Then I identified various gaps in the literature. So for example, like the critical mineral literature in particular had geographic gaps, focusing either on geographies like the Lithium Triangle in South America or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, given the various critical mineral reserves and human rights violations that occur in those areas. but there was less of a focus on kind of settler colonial contexts. And so I then analyzed various connections and overlap among the literature bodies, and this led me to the actual development of the framework itself. And so the framework is presented as a table with 4 broad concepts, and these concepts each have 3 associated sub-concepts for 12 sub-concepts in total. And the themes that I identified in the literature review were what really inspired the framework's sub-concepts. And each sub-concept has 1 or more indicator that goes along with it. And so these indicators are presented as open-ended questions which seek to put the sub-concepts into practice and analyze how policy considers my identified themes from the literature review. And so I'll go through the framework now. So the concepts are narratives and rationales, which investigate the justifications for critical mineral development in settler colonial contexts. Process and procedure investigate how policies are being created and how decisions are actually being made. Recognition acknowledges the negative effects of critical mineral extraction and the worldviews that underpin extraction. And finally, epistemic transformation recognizes the need to move beyond settler colonial structures and towards a decolonial or pluralistic understanding of the world. So under narratives and rationales, the first subconcept is extraction. So this refers to the physical removal of minerals from the ground, and it encompasses indicators that investigate how the policy is actually describing mining practices themselves, such as like sustainable or responsible mining, and then the areas that are actually being targeted specifically for extraction. The next subconcept are policy narratives and economic narratives, and so these include indicators that identify what political or economic justifications are utilized in policy documents, such as reference to energy transitions, prioritizing economic growth, or other kind of alternative economic narratives, and job creation. Under the next concept, the first subconcept is strategy development, which includes indicators that investigate the processes of policy creation by asking who is being included in these policies, are diverse views being incorporated, and how is territory itself actually being acknowledged within policy development. Decision-making then includes indicators that determine how decisions regarding critical mineral development are being made, and if there's reference to decision-making agreements with Indigenous nations or respect for self-determination. Consent is then just indicated by whether consent is discussed in the policy, as well as the level of consent that's being discussed. For example, are they talking specifically about free, prior, and informed consent, or is it more just generic? For recognition, named harms deals with the recognition of negative effects of critical mineral extraction and the structures that perpetuate these harms, with indicators seeking direct acknowledgement of these effects and structures. Indicators in the next subconcept, consequences, then seek recognition for the disproportionate effects of named harms on Indigenous peoples. And indicators for responses then capture whether the policy proposes avenues to actually address the harms and consequences, and how the costs and benefits are being distributed. And then the last concept, the first subconcept, is relationships, which identifies if the policy is actually talking about relationships and respect for more than humans, and how it describes relationship building with Indigenous communities. Consideration of worldviews includes indicators that determine how and if Indigenous knowledge is being incorporated into policy, and then how Indigenous knowledge is actually being defined. And then justice indicators simply determine whether justice and decolonization are being discussed in the policy at all. So are these terms even present? And so with the completion of this framework, I could then attempt to answer an additional research question of how is justice then being considered in Canadian critical mineral strategies if we want to achieve a just energy transition? And so I'm currently working on this policy analysis. So I'm looking at various critical mineral strategies across Canadian jurisdictions. So I'm looking at 1 federal policy, 9 provincial strategies, soon to be 10 when New Brunswick releases theirs, hopefully in March, and 1 territorial strategy. And these are all kind of dated between 2021 and 2024, so very close timelines. And as for outputs, I will have like 2 academic articles to submit for publication, as well as we'll be working on a policy brief and or blog post for the Smart Prosperity Institute as well. And so from the literature, there's a very clear emphasis on focusing on justice in energy transition and critical mineral development policy, but also going beyond ideas of mainstream justice perspectives to center Indigenous environmental justice. And from what I've seen, like within the policy so far, there's almost no discussion of justice at all, and there's very little recognition of the harms that extraction causes. Instead, there's sort of an uncritical focus on the need to meet this rising global demand through increased extraction or perpetuating economic growth narratives, as well as relying on economic reconciliation to guide relationships with Indigenous nations. Critical mineral extraction must also not perpetuate the systems that have historically allowed injustices to occur if we are to achieve a just energy transition, and therefore the framework is analyzing where these critical mineral strategies might be replicating settler colonial development and therefore impeding a just energy transition. And finally, a just energy transition will only be achievable if other understandings of the world are accepted. And so without the adequate inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and self-determination in critical mineral strategies and decisions, we will likely still see negative social and environmental outcomes being perpetuated. And identified in the literature is this need to go beyond a universal Western understanding of the world, recognizing that there are lifeways that exist beyond extractivism and settler colonialism. So ultimately, the framework is determining how critical mineral strategies support the transition to a just future. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and of course, thank you to the Smart Prosperity Institute and the EEPRN for supporting this research.
Good afternoon. Thank you for everyone in the room today, and thanks to the Smart Prosperity Institute for your ongoing support and inviting me to share with you today. Thank you for the reminder. So my name's Sarah Ozog, and I'm a PhD candidate in SFU's Resource and Environmental Management program. In this work, I have the privilege of working with Dr. Cliff Atleo Jr. as my supervisor, and I have the honor of working for and with the Haida Nation's Tilyata Energy Company, and I work under the direct supervision of Tilyata's manager and my friend Sean Brennan. The title of my work is Reconciliation and Decarbonization Policy Integration, Opportunities in the Haida Gwaii Energy Transition. So I'll begin with an overview of Haida Gwaii to highlight its uniqueness and remoteness, and hopefully everyone in the room has heard of Haida Gwaii, and if you haven't been there, it really is a very special and magical place. And so Haida Gwaii means Islands of the People, and it's an Indigenous territory managed and protected by the Haida Nation. In 2024 and 2025, the nation signed a title agreement with the provincial and federal governments, recognizing the Council of the Haida Nation's inherent right to title on the terrestrial lands of Haida Gwaii. The island is primarily diesel-generated electricity, so it's annually it's 10 million liters of diesel a year. That's just electricity generation, which equates to about 24,000 tons CO2 equivalent. So needless to say, the nation and the Council of the Haida Nation are ready and seeking a renewable energy transition to align with their goals and values. My overarching methodology and holding dual roles. So as I did for my master's research now 15 years ago, working again with the Haida Nation organizations, I worked as both a consultant and a researcher. And through this approach, I feel confident that I'm directly contributing to the nation's objectives. My Haida community supervisor supports this approach, and that really differs from the typical First Nation university relationship. You'll see a quote at the top of the slide by a brilliant Haida woman and scholar, Barb Wilson. And I find this quote sometimes quite powerful, so I'll let you read it. So my approach can be classified academically as both an Indigenous research paradigm and participatory action research, which is defined as a dual commitment in action research to study a system and concurrently to collaborate with members of the system in changing it into what is together regarded as a desirable direction. Accomplishing this twin goal requires the active collaboration of researcher and client, and thus it stresses the importance of co-learning as a primary aspect of the research process. So the system in this case being the electrical grid on Haida Gwaii and transforming its fuel source to clean power. So we began our team with an assessment of existing policy and mandates. So in 2021, this is the Haida Nation and Citizen Declaration. So the Haida Gwaii is about 4,500 people, 2,500, 2,000 of which are Haida members, and then the rest non-Haida, non-Indigenous. And this is the declaration from 2018. Thank you. Thank you. Which declared renewable energy transition and transformation, and their goal was by 2023. So following the declaration in 2020, the Haida Nation created Tilyata Energy, a company, as you know, to separate from the politics. This is quite common with First Nations as a way to expedite decision making. First Nations and non-First Nations, as we have many crown corporations in Canada too. And that was established in 2020, and Tilyata means in Haida to make it right. The company is comprised of 3 board members, and so there's representation from the Council of the Haida Nation and each of the 2 band councils, Skidegate and Old Masset, and that's the board. And the decision was made to start with a low impact and non-controversial technology to help build and establish Haida energy governance. So in 2021, the company with myself as a consultant began planning for a 2 megawatt solar PV array. And that would be located at the airport in Masset on northern Haida Gwaii. The goal of the project was to profitably sell the clean power to BC Hydro, who owns and operates the microgrid. So BC Hydro operates 14 microgrids in BC, and they call that their non-integrated area initiative. And then at this time in the presentation, I'll just note that for a conceptual lens, I actually do not apply the lens of energy justice or injustice, and instead I apply a policy co-benefits lens. And it's not to diminish the importance of those concepts, but instead I choose to focus on policy co-benefits, such as the co-benefits of diesel reduction to UNDRIP implementation. And I believe strongly that through this approach, the Haida Nation, who has trusted me to work with them, can be met with increased and really tangible energy transition results as a result of my participation. There's academic literature to support this approach of policy co-benefits. A 2021 paper by Cohen stated that targeting multiple co-benefits can help to identify synergies and increase the efficiency and cost effectiveness of interventions. And he even went so far as to explain that policy co-benefits assessments can be used as negotiating leverage with governments. And so this framework is really complementary to my role. My dual role is also a consultant working directly on the nation's objective and a researcher. And so from there, the Haida Nation had their eliminate diesel objective and mandate and policy, and then there was clear alignment with the Haida Nation's objective to eliminate diesel with those of the other governments. So in 2018, the provincial Clean BC plan set an 80% diesel-generated electricity reduction target. BC was also the first government in North America to pass their own UNDRIP legislation, and is still to this day is the only province in Canada. In 2019, the federal government sought to eliminate remote community diesel-generated electricity emissions or reduce it by 90%, and in 2021, Canada also passed Bill C-15, their own UNDRIP legislation. So next in our research, we quickly learned that Haida Gwaii represented the lion's share of provincial remote community emissions. So NRCan holds a data set of remote community diesel-generated electricity emissions across the country. And so on the left is Haida Gwaii in the green compared to the rest of British Columbia's remote community diesel-generated emissions, so it's lion's share. And then on the right, Haida Gwaii is the green with really the territories ahead of it, Quebec also, and Newfoundland. So quite significant when looking at Haida Gwaii compared to the rest of Canada's remote communities. We also learned through early research that the diesel is increasing. So 10 million liters of diesel is rising, and that's not only due to increased population. Here you see a spike in 2019, and that's really due to aging infrastructure. And as we researched, we learned of the economic challenges. So electricity in BC, it's already over 90% non-emitting. BC's blessed with incredible hydro resources. And so the electricity generation in BC actually only represents half of 1% of all emissions in the province. Haida Gwaii emissions don't even represent a fraction of obviously the total. Electricity rates on Haida Gwaii are heavily subsidized, so even though they're not connected to the grid, they pay almost the same as what anyone in Vancouver would. And a lack of utility scale battery storage meant only that for the 2 megawatt capacity solar farm, only about 50% of the solar power without a battery can actually be injected into the existing microgrid. And considerable infrastructure upgrades are required by BC Hydro to really accommodate the 2 megawatt solar farm. But by that point, we had already got started. So with those challenges, most importantly, we sought to answer what are the solutions. Through research, we learned that the Haida Nation wasn't alone, and not as a small state. And I gravitated in my literature review towards a recent Swiss study that identified 3 state goals of small states, all of which align with Haida Gwaii. And so those are energy security, energy sovereignty, and sustainable energy systems, and that's called the Impossible Energy Trinity. And the paper convincingly argues that when aiming to reach all 3 goals, the trade-offs are simply too great. And I draw parallels from this analysis to the Haida Nation situation, as currently they find themselves in the situation of energy insecure, as they rely on imported diesel for power, non-autonomous, electricity is generated and decisions are made by the provincial Crown Court BC Hydro, and dirty due to the reliance on diesel. So for my thesis, I apply a novel conceptual framework which combines the goals defined in the Impossible Energy Trinity of a small state with the principles of UNDRIP. So it forms the argument on your bottom right there, the circle. It forms the argument that the multi-level government commitments legally recognizing the distinct nature of Indigenous peoples provides a unique opportunity for the Haida Nation to manage the trade-offs normally required of a non-Indigenous state's energy transition. So we proceeded, and specific to TYE's solar project, we asked what policies and programs are in place to balance the trade-offs, and what is the right combination of provincial electricity price subsidies and capital funding grants required to balance the trade-offs. And as I mentioned before, the stars were aligned. So you have NRCan had a $220 million fund specifically for remote communities to provide the capital. They also had a separate Indigenous off-diesel initiative, $20 million fund, and then the provincial government holds a $60 million fund specifically for remote community diesel reduction. It's critical to note here that Canada's efforts really can only go so far when the existing infrastructure is managed and it's under provincial jurisdiction. So here, BC Hydro is the Crown Corp responsible for the non-integrated area. Their infrastructure really set the pace for the project. And success. So the project was 100% grant funded, approximately $10 million, and it was recently commissioned in December after 4 years. And currently it's the only project to be completed under the Clean BC mandate and on BC Hydro's non-integrated area. So just to put that in context, Stephanie offered earlier that on a daily basis, 2 gigawatts of capacity is developed in the world. This project took 4 years for 2 megawatts. Since this time, BC Hydro has since committed to installing battery storage and upgrades to their substation. However, the fixed electricity price, so it's public price that was offered to Tilyada, it still proves economically challenging given the high operating costs of operating in a remote environment. So Tilyada is now seeking to expand their 2 megawatts to 6 megawatts through a combination of grants and financing. And planning is underway for completion of both BC Hydro's upgrades, including the battery, and TYE's expansion by January 2028. And as we look forward now and we see relevant federal programs not being renewed, and BC's Premier is currently communicating needed amendments to the UNDRIP legislation that BC holds, we really must look and focus on other economic tools such as private financing, such as Canada Infrastructure Bank, such as investment tax credits, as the needed economic tools remote First Nations must use if their objective is diesel reduction to really balance these impossible trade-offs when the subsidies to higher carbon fuels so obviously exist.
Two really interesting and important topics. Any questions from the floor? Folks feeling a little tired? Should we like get up and do jumping jacks or something? Yes, question in the back there.
Awesome. Thank you. Really great presentations. Thank you so much. I found both of them quite fascinating. My question's actually for, is it Piper? Yes. In your literature review, how have you found the impact of ecosystems and specifically species that are of high importance to Indigenous populations? How have you found that that has been represented in the literature with regards to Indigenous impacts from critical mineral extraction and destruction of habitat, particular critical habitat, let's say?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a really important thing to ask. Unfortunately, like in the literature, there's not a lot of people talking specifically about this. So I tried, to rely on Indigenous scholars, like what they're saying about these topics. And so unfortunately, like a lot of the literature is a bit more broad when it comes to like the specificity of around which like animals or ecosystems are being talked about. So, but from an Indigenous environmental justice perspective, like broadly, like considering more than humans and sort of non-human beings is like a central component. And it's something that we don't always see like in policies created from kind of a Western worldview. So yeah, not a super specific answer to your question, but it is good that we are seeing like some consideration of this in the literature, like from these perspectives. It's just, we definitely need more work done in that area, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think Mallory has a question back there.
Thanks very much. Those are great presentations. My question's for you, Sarah. What are some of the takeaways from this success project, really, that you've just shared with us, or best practices and things that other people could apply in other similar situations with other First Nations, maybe facing the same energy issues?
There we go. So takeaways, and I guess two different buckets. One on the methodology side of things. I kind of said it earlier. Academia sometimes is criticized for the so what. When's it going to hit the ground? And for First Nations, we were talking about it earlier. There really are serious resource constraints and big goals and objectives. So, using this participatory action research and really just for researchers to keep coming back to what is the nation's objective, right? And to perform a study and leave them with a paper that no one's going to read, that's not reconciliation. But doing it this way, it takes much longer. It does take much longer, and it's almost double the amount of work. But I think that's the right way, and I think that is really recognizing the reconciliation that's needed there in terms of directly delivering on their objectives. And then as far as in terms of policy implications, our Tilyata team, we shaped policy on BC Hydro's NIA the last 4 years. So it was through negotiations on the electricity purchase agreement that really had Hydro arrive at a standing offer and a public rate. It will be the first project to have a battery installed on BC Hydro's non-integrated area, and that wouldn't occur if the project didn't take place at the speed it did, even though it took 4 years. So another takeaway is definitely, your research and working with First Nations. It's such a wonderful opportunity if you get that opportunity, and you really can shape public policy through actual projects on the ground.
Okay, I'll ask a question then. For the first paper, is there any difference between new mines or existing mines or mines under development in the way you can apply the framework? It seems to me there could be some differences between something that's already existing and working or something that's in the design phase. And then just on the second paper, again, very interesting. I just want to visualize, what does the grid actually look like there right now? Is it decentralized, a whole bunch of little generators, or is there, and then what's the vision for what it'll look like, down the road?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I mean, the framework itself is to address the policy that's driving critical mineral extraction. But yeah, I definitely think there would be obviously differences between how we analyze a mine that's kind of currently happening, and then because there's been a lot of legislative changes, especially in regards to how we approach engagement or consultation with Indigenous nations, whether or not we're seeing that change happen equally across Canada. I don't think that we are, because there are provincial differences for sure with regards to the implementation of UNDRIP, for example. So I think if we're using the framework to kind of look at new mines, maybe that's an opportunity to then integrate some of the components that I was talking about potentially into those considerations. But obviously it's more of a challenge when the mine's kind of existing, although there are conversations around expanding current mines, so they're not necessarily static, I guess. But yeah, it's a great question. Thanks.
The grid on Haida Gwaii, it's quite interesting. So there's actually 2 microgrids that are only separated by a 12-kilometer gap of transmission line, and the northern grid is 100% diesel-generated electricity. The southern grid has a hydro dam, which operates about 60 to 70% of the full profile down there, and then the rest would be diesel-generated electricity. And so both grids together, it's around 51 gigawatt hours total. And they have looked at, studies have been done on connecting the grids, but without a surplus of clean power, there's a lot of questions on economic viability. And then the price tag at this point, it's ranged. One of the lessons we learned through this project, because BC Hydro had really not integrated, besides hydropower, any other renewable sources onto their microgrids before, receiving estimates and cost estimates on the work, highly challenging. So we've seen ranges to connect the 2 microgrids anywhere between $25 and $100 million.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, up here in the front.
Thank you. I have a question for both of you too. So you mentioned the critical mineral extraction. So far, I understand the big problem in the mineral extraction is the water. You also mentioned the alternatives is renewable energy, some new technologies, something like solar panels, and some batteries in the EVs. So, but my question is, for recycling, in terms of recycling, we need the new technologies. It's costly, and it also causes pollution. So how could I understand this? Because alternatives, we also see the pollutions, so thank you.
Yeah, so just to understand, like talking about kind of the fact that recycling or kind of circular economy is still creating like waste if we move away from primary kind of extractive methods, is that kind of your question? Yeah, so that's a great point. Like, yes, recycling does. Yeah, I guess. For sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think where my mind goes, I guess, is something that's come up in my research is that there's this focus on economic growth, and kind of each mineral strategy that I looked at so far has definitely relied on opening new mines or kind of increasing extraction, although some policies are also talking about recycling as well, and some do mention like circular economy. But I think something that is not talked about is moving away from growth itself and looking at alternatives to growth, like degrowth or other ways of envisioning structures. And obviously, that's something that's not really going to be talked about because economic growth, you know, we think of the importance of that for the economy and everything. But I think maybe that kind of answers your question in terms of like, yeah, recycling also causes problems. So if we're not looking at recycling, then maybe we need to reduce the amount that we actually require, I guess is the only thing that I can think of.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Applause for Sarah and Piper. So we're going to end the way we started, with Derek and Jeff giving you their thoughts. Yes, Derek, you're up first. Great. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor for reflections. I really encourage anybody who hasn't asked a question, spoken yet today, to please raise your hand and make this your moment. I want to hear as many voices as we can today. So, come on up.
Thanks, and yeah, I'll be short and sweet, hopefully. But just thanks again to everyone who's here. Thank you to all the presenters. It was a really interesting and variable group of research and presentations. I learned a lot. I hope others did too. Thanks for the organizers. I'll let Jeff go into the list of specific names, but thanks to everybody who organized this. We just show up and get to see all the presentations, but I know a lot of work goes into the planning and everything. And yeah, it's just great to see some of the research that was funded or co-funded through the network. And again, the sort of interdisciplinary, and I always come back to like the gains from trade that we have when we're partnering up policy people with academic people, and hope we can continue to keep this going in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Derek, for that, and thank you again for ECC's continuing support of the network. We've seen today the results of the research, and this was only the latest version. There's been iterations of this over the past more than 10 years, as I mentioned at the beginning, leading to different interdisciplinary expertise of students coming out, policy-oriented skill sets built in communicating the research and thinking about the so what of the academic research that's being done that I think is leading to a different generation of scholars and practitioners that we're contributing to training in the country. And I think that's a very valuable thing. As we saw today, we've been taking a deliberate approach within the EPRN to thinking in our funding more about identifying and supporting clusters of research at the same time that are related to specific topics. We used to do much broader casts of topics in our RFPs. You've seen today we had a group focused on circular economy that I think have related lessons from each other, from firm level climate policy, from thinking about climate justice. We're trying to sort of take that approach forward. We have a call that just concluded right now and we're evaluating for that's focused more on the idea of clean competitiveness and economic resilience. And we'll see what we can take from that and the sort of sessions we can put together there going forward. But I thank everybody for the work they've done, the reflections that the students brought today for and the professors, really interesting research that's being done. We really appreciate your contributions to the network because without your interest in your efforts in moving forward, it wouldn't be here. Last but certainly not least, the people Derek mentioned that I have to try to remember everybody's name. First, she's been wandering around all day. I've lost track of her. Mariana Carrillo has done an immense amount of work pulling this together, being in touch with everybody. Keep everybody on time, getting everybody here, organizing this whole event. We couldn't have done it without her. Very much appreciated. Working very closely alongside Marina Winstanley, who has been working with me for a number of years on this network, and it wouldn't be what it is today without her contributions either. So thank you, Marina. And in addition, I think they're mainly hiding in the back, but we have a comms team who's been putting together and tweeting out and working on things that we're doing today. So our comms director, Mallory, and also Mac over on the side. We also have student note takers who have been in the room today taking notes, and we'll be sharing those coming out. Marina, I believe, will be sharing slides at some point in some format going forward, and so stay tuned and you'll hear about that, or if you're not already on our mailing list, make sure you're there, and that's how we'll communicate it. Anything else I'm forgetting? No, I think that covers it mainly off for now. Are you taking the reins for the moderator sessions from here? No, that's good. Thank you very much for coming, and I really appreciate the contributions.
All right, don't leave me up here talking to myself. New voices. Who wants to share an insight, a moment where they were like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way before, or I learned something new, or what's a takeaway that if somebody said, when you go home and your mom goes, what did you learn at school today? What would you say? Any takers? Quiet group.
I had this thought after Piper's presentation, actually, and I didn't get a chance to ask you questions, but it's not really a question because I know the answer. As you were looking through these critical minerals policies, and I remember doing this in my master's, and so this is part of the energy justice and Indigenous rights topic. I know it's more often than not with these major projects, it's not clear what the full economic benefit of the project is to the government, whether it's provincial and federal government, that's GDP or royalties or downstream economic benefits. And so I assume that hasn't changed. No, that hasn't changed. So it's just something that I think it's a good research area going forward in terms of Indigenous rights. Sometimes there's opposition to these projects. Provincial and territorial governments want to proceed, but really that economic picture isn't clear. And at minimum, they could get that economic picture clear if they're going to advance despite Indigenous rights. So just wanted to offer that.
Anybody else? I'm just going to make it awkward, so. Yeah, Bianca. Too late.
Thanks. I was telling Marina earlier that I had an insight from the session that was after lunch, and I just thought everything connected so well, even though at first sight it wouldn't, but it really did, because we were talking about how when you impose regulation, that trickles down into other countries, and that might have detrimental effects. And to take that into account in policy, you need standards, and standards that take into account the supply chain, not just what you're producing in your own company, which then gets to the disclosures part. And then also, thinking of standards and disclosures, you think of these misallocations and the fact that you need to standardize these policies to make it more efficient. So I just thought those things connected so well, and made me think that events like these are important to make those connections appear, because we often don't think of them and are working in our own little silos, and it's important to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that brings it back to your point, Anne, that you made earlier today about interdisciplinary and how important it is that we work together in teams and share insights and collaboration. Not to put you on the spot, but was there anything else that perhaps you would want to add to the conversation?
No, sorry.
Good one. Okay, I'll take it. Yeah, Felix.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so for me, I think it's so mostly as a researcher, when we want to learn something about policies, our focus is to kind of look for the big policies, the ones that has national attention. But from the first presentation, I think we could also look at those kind of sub-policies, those that are at regional levels, provincial levels, municipalities, and also dive into those. And with good data, maybe we could also learn something good from those even smaller policies, instead of trying to think about those big national policies. So, and I think through this presentation, I've seen that there's a lot of those policies that we could also dive into if we want to learn more. Yeah, thank you.
But I'm seeing lots of nodding heads. One more. Yes, Mallory.
Thank you. I ask my girls every day after school, what's something that happened that was weird or cool or gross, or, and instead of the usual, how was school? And I always get more interesting answers. So I'll just say, being someone with a background in science communications and no policy experience, and being the director of comms at the Smart Prosperity Institute is always very interesting and humbling and challenging in good ways. And I appreciate also, a lot of us work from home, being in a room with people, being in a room with economists and policy experts, and being able to listen and learn. It's not only great for my work, but I just wanted you all to know that the work you do in communicating your work is really important and really valuable in and of itself. So, go home happy that you contributed to that, because it does trickle down into communicating messages to people, and there's an effect in that too. So, yeah, bravo to you all. Thank you.
I think that's a great place to end. Bravo for all of us. And I'll give you back half an hour in your day. I believe there's still some coffee, some soda. Please stick around.